The night Eleanor Price agreed to marry a stranger, she didn't know his Apache name meant storm that speaks. She didn't know the townspeople would spit at her shadow, or that her wedding gift would contain the power to destroy everything or save it. What she knew was this: her father was 3 days dead, the bank owned their land, and the only proposal she'd received came on territorial paper, signed by a man the frontier called dangerous. By morning, she'd be on a train heading west into a marriage that would either kill her or set her free. But before we reveal what happened next, I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Now, let's begin. The Kansas earth had turned to dust, and with it, any hope Eleanor Price had of remaining the person she used to be. She stood in what was left of her father's house. 4 walls that no longer belonged to her, windows that framed a horizon bleached white by drought and the merciless sun of 1874. The furniture had been sold 3 weeks ago. The livestock, 2 weeks before that. Yesterday, they'd taken her mother's piano, the only beautiful thing Eleanor had ever known how to love without fear. Her father's body was still warm in the ground. She was 19 years old, alone, and had exactly $4.30 to her name. The bank officer, Mr. Henshaw, had made it clear that by week's end, even the walls around her would belong to someone else. He'd said it with something almost like pity, his soft hands folded on the deed papers, his eyes avoiding hers. Your father was a good man, Miss Price, but good don't pay debts. Eleanor had nodded because there was nothing else to do. Good didn't pay debts. Good didn't stop the rain from staying away for 2 years. Good didn't keep your father's heart from giving out when he tried to dig a well in ground hard as iron. Good got you nowhere at all. She walked through the empty room slowly, her footsteps echoing in spaces that used to hold laughter, argument, the smell of bread, and her father's tobacco. The echoes sounded like ghosts. She supposed that's what they were. This house was already haunted, not by the dead, but by everything that would never happen here again. In her bedroom, the only piece of furniture left was her narrow bed, and only because Mr. Henshaw had said she could keep it until she made arrangements. Arrangements. As if she were planning a party instead of the end of her life as she knew it. On the bed lay a single piece of paper. She'd found it 2 days ago, pinned to the message board outside the general store in town. She'd been walking past, numb and aimless, when the word wife had caught her eye. The notice read, "Respectable woman sought for marriage. Territorial arrangement. Transport and provisions provided. Inquiries to be made through Land Office, Tucson, Arizona Territory. Respond by telegraph, discretion assured." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly personal. But it was an answer to a question Eleanor hadn't known how to ask. What now? She'd torn the notice down, folded it into her pocket, and walked to the telegraph office before she could talk herself out of it. The operator, a rail-thin man with spectacles, had raised his eyebrows when she dictated her message. "You sure about this, miss? Arizona's a long way off. Rough country." "Send it," she'd said. The reply had come within a day. Faster than she'd expected. Faster than seemed decent, really, as if whoever was on the other end had been waiting. Offer accepted. Funds for passage wired. Arrival expected within fortnight. Marriage to be conducted upon meeting. Terms honorable. That was it. No name, no greeting, just facts, like a business contract, which Eleanor supposed was exactly what it was. She picked up the paper now, reading it for perhaps the 100th time, searching for something she might have missed, some clue about the man she was about to bind her life to. But there was nothing, just the cold efficiency of words that promised transportation, provisions, terms. Honorable. She almost laughed. What did honor mean to a man who advertised for a wife like he was ordering cattle? But then again, what did it matter? She had no other options. The women in town had made it clear there would be no help coming from them. She'd seen it in their faces at her father's funeral, the way they'd whispered behind gloved hands, the way they'd looked at her like she was already gone. A young woman alone was a problem nobody wanted to inherit. She could try to find work, but doing what? She could read and write and play piano, none of which were skills that kept you fed on the frontier. She could sew adequately, cook tolerably, but so could every other woman for 100 miles, and none of them were starving badly enough to give up their positions. She'd considered, briefly, the darker alternatives, the kind of work women did when they ran out of choices. But even desperation had its limits, and Eleanor wasn't there yet. Not quite yet. So, Arizona. A stranger. A marriage that probably meant hard work and loneliness, and a life nothing like the one she'd imagined as a girl. But it meant survival. And right now, survival was the only ambition she could afford. The train left in 2 days. Eleanor spent her last night in Kansas sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars come out over land that would never be hers. The sky was enormous here, unbroken by trees or mountains, just an endless sweep of darkness pinned with light. She tried to memorize it, the specific quality of the silence, the way the wind moved through the dry grass, the smell of dust and distance. She wondered if Arizona would be different. She wondered if she would be different there. Probably not, she thought. You carried yourself with you, no matter how far you went. Behind her, the house stood empty and dark. Tomorrow, Mr. Henshaw's men would come to clear out whatever was left, prepare it for sale or demolition or whatever happened to places nobody wanted anymore. Eleanor wouldn't be here to see it. By tomorrow, she'd be on a train heading west, and this chapter of her life would be over. She should have felt sad. Probably, she should have cried. But she'd discovered over the past few weeks that grief had a limit, a point where it burned itself out and left only a strange, flat calm. She'd reached that point. Now she just felt tired and ready, in a distant way, for whatever came next, even if it terrified her. The train station in Hutchinson was crowded with people coming and going, all of them moving with the purposeful energy of those who had places to be. Eleanor stood on the platform with her single carpet bag, feeling invisible among them. She wore her best dress, dark blue cotton, practical and plain, and her mother's cameo brooch pinned at her throat. It was the only piece of jewelry she'd kept, too small to be worth selling, too precious to let go. Her hair was pinned up neatly, her gloves were clean. She looked, she hoped, like a respectable woman. The kind of woman a man might reasonably want to marry, sight unseen. She tried not to think too hard about what kind of man would want such an arrangement. The train arrived with a shriek of steam and metal, and Eleanor climbed aboard, finding a seat by the window. The car was half empty, populated mostly by men in work clothes and a few tired-looking families. Nobody paid her any attention. She was grateful for that. As the train pulled away from the station, Eleanor watched Kansas disappear behind her. First the town, then the outlying farms, then just the endless flat prairie stretching to the horizon. She watched until there was nothing left to see, and then she closed her eyes and tried not to think about the fact that she was heading toward a man whose name she didn't even know. The journey west took 6 days. 6 days of rattling tracks and cramped seats, of sleeping upright and eating stale bread from her bag. 6 days of watching the landscape change outside the window, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills, then to something raw and stranger. The earth turned red. The sky seemed bigger, if that was possible. The green disappeared, replaced by tough scrub brush and rock, and distances that looked like they'd never been crossed. This was frontier country, real frontier, not the settled farmland of Kansas. Eleanor could feel the difference in her bones. The sense that civilization here was temporary, provisional, a thin veneer over something much older and wilder. She shared the car with a rotating cast of travelers, prospectors heading to mining camps, soldiers being transferred to remote outposts, a few grim-faced families seeking land or fortune or escape. Nobody talked much. Everyone looked tired. On the 4th day, an older woman with a weathered face and kind eyes sat down across from Eleanor. "You traveling alone, dear?" she asked. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "That's brave, or foolish. Hard to tell which sometimes." The woman smiled to soften the words. "Where are you headed?" "Arizona Territory, Tucson." "Tucson? Lord have mercy, that's rough country down there. You got family waiting?" Eleanor hesitated. "A husband," she said, and the word felt strange in her mouth, like something she was trying on that didn't quite fit. The woman's eyebrows rose. "A husband? You're married already." "Not yet, but I will be when I arrive." Understanding dawned in the woman's face, followed by something that might have been sympathy or judgment. Eleanor couldn't tell which. Ah, one of those arrangements. Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. Yes. The woman was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then she reached across and patted Eleanor's hand. Well, dear, I hope he's a good man. And if he's not, I hope you're strong enough to make the best of it anyway. That's all any of us can do, really. Thank you, Eleanor said, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking the woman for. The woman got off at the next stop, and Eleanor was alone again. They reached Tucson on a brutally hot afternoon, the sun hanging in the sky like a punishment. Eleanor stepped off the train onto a platform that seemed to shimmer with heat, the air so dry it hurt to breathe. Tucson was smaller than she'd expected, a collection of low adobe buildings scattered across land that looked like it had never heard of rain. Everything was brown and beige and pale gold. The buildings, the earth, even the sky seemed bleached of color. It looked like the edge of the world. Eleanor stood on the platform, gripping her carpet bag, and tried to steady her breathing. This was it. Somewhere in this town was the man she was about to marry. The man who'd paid for her passage, who'd arranged this whole thing through terse telegrams and land office communications. The man whose name she still didn't know. She was supposed to go to the land office. That's what the telegram had said. Someone would meet her there. She found it easily enough. A squat building near the center of town with a hand-painted sign. Inside, it was blessedly cooler, though still warm enough that Eleanor could feel sweat gathering under her collar. A clerk looked up from his desk, a middle-aged man with a sunburned nose and suspicious eyes. "Help you?" "I'm Eleanor Price," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was told to report here. For a marriage arrangement." The clerk's expression didn't change. "Right. You're the Kansas girl. He said you'd be coming." He stood up, brushing dust from his pants. "Wait here. I'll fetch him." "Fetch who?" Eleanor asked, but the clerk was already gone, disappearing through a back door. Eleanor stood in the empty office, her heart beating too fast. This was it. In a moment, she'd meet him. In a moment, everything would become real. She tried to imagine what he'd look like. Old, probably. Why else would he need to send away for a wife? Rough, certainly. Maybe cruel. Maybe kind. Maybe... The door opened. The man who entered was not what Eleanor had expected. He was young, not much older than she was, perhaps 25 or 26. Tall, lean, with dark hair and darker eyes, and a face that was striking in a way that made Eleanor forget, just for a moment, how to breathe. He wore simple clothes, a cotton shirt, canvas pants, boots, but he moved with a kind of quiet authority that filled the room. And his skin was brown, not sunburned brown, like the clerk. Brown in a way that Eleanor, in her 19 sheltered years, had only seen a handful of times. Brown in a way that meant he was not white, not European, not anything the people back in Kansas would have considered acceptable for a husband. He was Apache. Eleanor's mind went blank with shock. Then it flooded with understanding, with all the pieces clicking into place. The vague advertisement, the lack of details, the speed of the arrangement, the fact that no respectable white woman would have agreed to this if she'd known. She'd been tricked. Or maybe she'd tricked herself by not asking the right questions. The man, her intended husband, stopped a respectful distance away and looked at her with eyes that were calm and unreadable. "Miss Price," he said. His English was perfect, unaccented. "My name is Talon Greyhawk. I'm the man you've come here to marry." Eleanor stared at him. Her mouth was dry. Her mind was racing through implications, through what this meant, through the fact that she'd traveled 6 days across the frontier to marry an Apache. And if she refused now, she had no money to get home, no home to get back to, nothing at all, except... "I understand," Talon said quietly, "that this may not be what you expected." That was such a spectacular understatement that Eleanor almost laughed, would have laughed if she weren't on the verge of panic. "You're Indian," she said, and heard how stupid it sounded the moment the words left her mouth. "Yes," Talon said simply. "Apache. From the Chiricahua band, though I haven't lived with my people full-time in several years. I was educated at a mission school in Santa Fe. I speak English, Spanish, and 3 Apache dialects. I work as a translator and negotiator between the territorial government and various Apache leaders. The marriage arrangement was suggested by the territorial governor as a way to demonstrate good faith, to show that peace between our peoples is possible. He said all of this evenly, like he was reciting facts, but Eleanor could hear something underneath, a tension, maybe, or resignation. So I'm, Eleanor said slowly, a political gesture. Yes, Talon said. He didn't try to soften it. And I apologize for the deception. The advertisement was written by the land office clerk, not by me. I assumed you understood what you were agreeing to. I see now that you didn't. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She gripped her carpet bag tighter to hide it. And if I refuse? Talon's expression didn't change. Then I'll pay for your passage back to Kansas. You'll leave on tomorrow's train with enough money to start over. I won't force this on you, Miss Price. Marriage should be a choice, not a trap. He meant it. Eleanor could hear the sincerity in his voice, which somehow made everything worse because it meant she actually had to decide, had to weigh her options like they were real, instead of just accepting the inevitable. She could go back, take his money and return to Kansas and what? The same nothing that had been waiting for her before? Mr. Henshaw's pity and the bank's indifference and the slow grinding poverty of trying to survive alone? Or she could stay, marry this stranger, this Apache stranger who the town probably hated, who was using her as a symbol in a political game she didn't understand, but who was offering her a choice, who was standing here, calm and respectful, waiting for her answer instead of demanding her compliance. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. He was handsome, she realized, in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Strong-featured, intelligent-looking. His eyes were dark but not cold. His hands, hanging relaxed at his sides, were scarred across the knuckles but clean, the nails trimmed. He looked like a man who'd lived through things, who'd survived. Maybe that was what she needed to do now, survive. If I agree, Eleanor heard herself say, what would the marriage be like? What would you expect of me? Talon considered the question. Respect, he said finally. And companionship, if you're willing to give it. I won't demand anything else. You'll have your own space in my home. I'll provide for you food, clothing, safety. In return, I ask that you treat me with basic human dignity and allow the territorial officials to see that the marriage exists. Beyond that, he shrugged slightly. We'll figure out the rest as we go. You're not expecting a real wife, Eleanor said. Just the appearance of one. I'm expecting, Talon said carefully, whatever you're able to give. If that's only appearances, then so be it. I won't ask for more than you're willing to offer. It should have been reassuring. Somehow, it just made Eleanor feel more lost. She thought about Kansas, about her father's grave and the empty house, and the future that didn't exist. She thought about the look in the clerk's eyes when Talon had walked in, a mixture of disgust and fear that told her exactly what kind of life she'd have here as an Apache man's wife. She thought about the fact that she was tired, so tired of being afraid and alone and desperate. All right, she said. The word came out hoarse. She cleared her throat and tried again. All right, I'll marry you. Talon's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or relief. He nodded slowly. Thank you, Miss Price. Eleanor, she said, if we're going to be married, you should call me Eleanor. Eleanor? He repeated, and the way he said her name, careful, respectful, made something in her chest tighten. When? She asked. When does this happen? Now, if you're willing, the territorial judge is waiting next door. It won't take long. Of course it wouldn't. This wasn't a real wedding, after all. It was a formality, a piece of paper that would tie her to this man, to this place, to a life she couldn't begin to imagine. Eleanor took a deep breath. Then, let's get it over with. The ceremony was exactly as impersonal as Eleanor had expected. The judge was a portly man with mutton chops and an air of barely concealed irritation, as if officiating this particular marriage was a waste of his valuable time. He recited the words mechanically, stumbling slightly over Talon's name, his eyes never quite meeting Eleanor's. There were two witnesses, the land office clerk and a Mexican woman who appeared to work as the judge's housekeeper. Both looked uncomfortable. Eleanor stood next to Talon in the judge's cramped office, acutely aware of the space between them, of the fact that they weren't touching, that there was nothing romantic or tender about any of this. It felt like a transaction, like signing away her life on a ledger. "Do you, Talon Greyhawk, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was steady. Eleanor wondered if he felt anything at all, or if this was just another negotiation to him, another political maneuver. "And do you, Eleanor Price, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor's throat was tight. This was the moment, the last chance to run. But where would she run to? "I do," she whispered. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you man and wife. You may... Well, that'll be all. No kiss, no celebration. Just the scratch of the judge's pen on paper, making it official." Eleanor stared at the marriage certificate, at her name next to Talon's in formal black ink. Mrs. Eleanor Greyhawk. It looked like someone else's name, someone else's life. "Congratulations," the judge said flatly, and handed the certificate to Talon. And just like that, Eleanor was married. They left the judge's office in silence. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. The heat was finally breaking, replaced by something almost pleasant. Talon walked beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. He hadn't tried to touch her, Eleanor realized. Not during the ceremony, not after. Some men would have claimed their rights immediately, would have grabbed her hand or her arm, would have made it clear that she belonged to them now. But Talon walked like they were strangers sharing a sidewalk. Polite. Careful. Eleanor didn't know if she should be grateful or insulted. "My horse is this way," Talon said, gesturing toward the edge of town. "It's about an hour's ride to where I live. We can go tomorrow if you prefer. I can arrange a room for you at the boarding house tonight." "No," Eleanor said quickly. "No, I'd rather just get there. Get it over with." Talon nodded and led her to where a paint horse stood tied to a hitching post. The animal was beautiful, white and brown patches, intelligent eyes. It turned its head to look at them, ears swiveling. "This is Sky," Talon said, running a hand down the horse's neck. "She's gentle. You'll ride with me, if that's acceptable." Eleanor had ridden before, but never behind a man on horseback, never pressed close to a stranger's back. But she nodded, because what else was she going to do? Talon mounted easily, then reached down to help her up. His hand was warm and calloused when she took it, strong enough to pull her up behind him with seemingly no effort. Eleanor settled awkwardly on the horse's back, trying to figure out where to put her hands. "Hold on to me," Talon said quietly. "It's safer." Hesitantly, Eleanor wrapped her arms around his waist. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his shirt, could feel the way he breathed. It was the closest she'd ever been to a man who wasn't her father. It felt strange. Not bad exactly. Just strange. Talon made a soft clicking sound, and Sky started moving, carrying them away from Tucson, away from anything familiar, toward whatever came next. They rode east into country that grew rougher and more remote with each passing mile. The town disappeared behind them quickly, swallowed by the vast landscape of red rock and scattered brush. Mountains rose in the distance, purple against the darkening sky. Eleanor had thought Kansas was empty, but this was different. This was a wilderness that seemed to have no interest in human concerns, a land that would kill you if you weren't careful and wouldn't even notice you were gone. She held on to Talon and tried not to think about how far from civilization they were getting. After a while, Talon spoke. "Are you from Kansas originally?" It took Eleanor a moment to realize he was trying to make conversation. "Yes," she said. "Born there. Lived there my whole life until now." "And your family?" "Dead. My mother 5 years ago. My father 3 weeks ago." She said it flatly, without emotion, because that was the only way she could say it at all. "I'm sorry." "So am I." They rode in silence for a while longer. Then Eleanor asked, "What about your family?" Talon was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My mother is still alive," he said finally. She lives with the Chiricahua in the mountains to the south. My father died when I was 12, in a fight with soldiers. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. I'm sorry seemed inadequate. It was a long time ago, Talon said. More silence. The sky was turning deep purple now, stars beginning to appear. Eleanor had lost track of where they were. Everything looked the same in the darkness, just shapes and shadows. Where exactly are we going? She asked. To a place between, Talon said. Not in town, but not in Apache land either. Neutral ground. It's where I've been living since I started working as a translator. A small house, nothing fancy, but it's safe. Safe. Eleanor wondered what that meant out here. Safe from what? From whom? But she didn't ask. Finally, after what felt like hours, Talon guided Skye toward a dark shape in the distance. As they got closer, Eleanor could make out a small adobe structure, low and simple, with a covered porch and a corral beside it. A single window glowed with lamplight. We're here, Talon said. He dismounted first, then helped Eleanor down. Her legs were stiff from riding, and she stumbled slightly. Talon's hand shot out to steady her, then released her immediately once she'd found her balance. Come inside, he said. I'll tend to Skye, then bring your bag. Eleanor walked toward the house on shaking legs, exhausted from travel and fear and too many emotions she couldn't name. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped into what was now, impossibly, her home. The interior was simple but clean. One main room with a cooking area, a table, 2 chairs, woven rugs on the floor, a shelf of books against one wall, 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. It was nicer than she'd expected, more civilized. Talon came in behind her carrying her carpet bag and a small wooden box she hadn't noticed before. He set both on the table. That room is yours, he said, pointing to the door on the left. I'll sleep in the other one. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash, food in the pantry if you're hungry. And this, he picked up the wooden box. This is for you. A wedding gift, I suppose. Eleanor stared at the box. It was beautifully made, carved with intricate patterns that might have been Apache symbols, or might have just been decoration. She couldn't tell. What is it? She asked. Open it when you're ready, Talon said. Not now, later, when you've had time to think, when you've decided what kind of marriage this is going to be. He said it gently, but there was something in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope, though Eleanor couldn't imagine what he had to hope for. I'll leave you alone now, Talon continued. You must be exhausted. Sleep as late as you like tomorrow. We'll talk more then. And before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the other room and closing the door behind him with a soft click. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, holding the carved box, and finally let herself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears of exhaustion and fear and the overwhelming strangeness of everything that had happened in the past few weeks. She was married to a man she didn't know, an Apache man, in a place that felt like the end of the earth, and she had no idea what happened next. Eventually, Eleanor carried the box and her bag into the room Talon had indicated was hers. It was small but comfortable. A narrow bed with clean blankets, a chest of drawers, a wash basin on a stand. The window looked out onto darkness and distance. She set the box on the chest of drawers without opening it. She wasn't ready to know what was inside. Not yet. Instead, she washed her face with water from the pitcher, changed into her nightgown, and climbed into bed. The mattress was softer than she'd expected. The blanket smelled like sage and something else she couldn't identify. Clean, though. Everything was clean. Outside, she could hear night sounds. Insects, distant animal calls, the wind moving through the brush. It should have been frightening, but somehow it wasn't. It was just there. The sound of a world that existed whether she was in it or not. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to sleep. And in the other room, Talon Greyhawk lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life, or the bravest decision. He'd seen the fear in Eleanor's eyes when she'd realized what he was. The shock. The moment where she'd almost run. But she hadn't run. She'd stayed. She'd made a choice, even if it was a choice born of desperation. That was something. Maybe not much, but something. Talon turned onto his side and closed his eyes, listening to the silence of the house, now shared with a stranger who was his wife in name, if not in any way that mattered. Tomorrow, they'd begin to figure out what that meant. Tonight, they were just two desperate people trying to survive in a world that wanted neither of them to exist. And somewhere on the chest of drawers in Eleanor's room, the carved wooden box sat waiting, holding secrets that would change everything. But that revelation would have to wait for morning. For now, the house was quiet, and the desert night stretched on, indifferent to the fragile new bond that had been formed in its midst. Eleanor Greyhawk now, fell into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of dust and distance and dark eyes that held secrets she couldn't read. And the story of what would become of them both was only just beginning. Morning came too early, announced by light that sliced through the window like a blade. Eleanor woke disoriented, her body aching from yesterday's long ride, her mind struggling to remember where she was and why everything felt wrong. Then it all came back. The marriage. The stranger. The wooden box still sitting on the chest of drawers, unopened. She sat up slowly, listening for sounds from the other room. Nothing. The house was silent except for the creak of wood expanding in the heat that was already building despite the early hour. Eleanor dressed quickly in the same blue cotton dress from yesterday. It was one of only 3 she owned now, and pinned up her hair with trembling fingers. In the small mirror above the wash basin, her reflection looked pale and frightened, dark circles under her eyes from poor sleep. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had no idea what she was doing. When she finally gathered the courage to leave her room, she found Talon already up, standing at the stove with his back to her. He was making coffee, the smell rich and foreign in the small space. He'd changed his shirt, but otherwise looked exactly as he had yesterday, calm, controlled, unreadable. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Good morning," he said. "Did you sleep?" "Some," Eleanor lied. "You?" "Enough." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. "There's bread and dried meat if you're hungry. I'll make something more substantial later, but I thought you might want coffee first." Eleanor took the cup, grateful for something to do with her hands. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the way her father had made it, but it was warm and real, and that was enough. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and Eleanor realized with a strange jolt that this was her life now. These awkward morning silences with a man she didn't know. This small house in the middle of nowhere. This careful dance of 2 strangers trying to share space. "I need to ride out this morning," Talon said, breaking the quiet. "There's a meeting with some of the Apache leaders. They want to discuss the new territorial boundaries. I should be back by afternoon." He paused, watching her face. "You can stay here, or if you'd prefer, I can take you back to town. You could spend the day there, meet some of the other women, start to establish yourself." The way he said it made it clear he knew exactly what kind of reception she'd get in town. The new wife of the Apache translator, the white woman who'd married an Indian. She'd be a curiosity at best, a traitor at worst. "I'll stay here," Eleanor said quickly. Something that might have been relief crossed Talon's face. "There's food in the pantry. Books on the shelf if you read. Don't go wandering too far from the house. The land can be dangerous if you don't know it. And if anyone comes," he hesitated. "If anyone comes and I'm not here, don't answer the door unless you're certain they're friendly." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Are you expecting trouble?" "No," Talon said, "but I'm not expecting safety either. This is frontier country, Eleanor. It's better to be careful." He finished his coffee in one swallow, set down the cup, and moved toward the door. Then he stopped, turned back. "The box I gave you last night, have you opened it yet?" "No." "When you do," he said quietly, "know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it. That's all I ask. Just respect in return for respect." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Eleanor stood alone in the house that was now supposedly hers and wondered what exactly she'd gotten herself into. The hours passed slowly. Eleanor cleaned the already clean kitchen, examined the books on Talon's shelf, a strange mix of Apache language texts, English classics, and what looked like legal documents, and eventually ventured outside to explore the immediate area around the house. The landscape was stark and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Red rock formations rose in the distance, their shadows shifting as the sun climbed higher. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at directly. Everything was dry and harsh, and somehow perfect in its harshness. She found a small garden plot behind the house, carefully tended, with plants she didn't recognize growing in neat rows. Evidence that Talon had been here a while, had put down roots of a sort. It made him seem more real somehow, more human. Not just the stoic stranger from yesterday, but someone who planted things and waited for them to grow. By midday, Eleanor couldn't stand it anymore. She went back inside, walked to her room, and picked up the carved wooden box. It was heavier than it looked, the wood smooth under her fingers from handling or age or both. The carvings were intricate, geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story she couldn't read. Apache symbols, she assumed, though she had no way of knowing what they meant. Her hand shook as she worked the clasp. It opened with a soft click. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded carefully, and underneath it, a small silver key on a leather cord. Eleanor's breath caught. She lifted out the paper first, unfolded it with fingers that wouldn't quite steady. The handwriting was precise, almost formal, in dark ink. Eleanor, this box and its contents are yours. The key opens a lockbox kept at the Tucson land office under your name. Inside that box is money, enough to purchase train passage back to Kansas or to anywhere else you might wish to go, plus additional funds to help you start a new life. I give you this for one reason, so that you know your presence here is a choice, not a prison. If you stay, it must be because you wish to, not because you have no other option. I will not speak of this gift. If you choose to use it and leave, I will not stop you or ask for explanations. If you choose to stay, the money remains yours, held in trust should you ever change your mind. You are not my property. You are not my prisoner. You are a woman who deserves the dignity of choice. Whatever you decide, I will respect it. Talon Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she picked up the key, felt its weight in her palm. He'd given her freedom. Real freedom, not just words. He'd given her the means to leave, to escape this marriage, to run back to everything she'd known or forward to something entirely new. He'd put power in her hands and asked for nothing in return except the knowledge that if she stayed, it would be because she wanted to. Eleanor sat down on the edge of her bed, the letter still clutched in one hand, the key in the other, and tried to understand what kind of man would do this. What kind of husband would marry a woman and immediately give her the tools to leave him? An honorable one, she realized, or a desperate one, or maybe just one who understood what it felt like to be trapped and refused to do that to someone else. She thought about Kansas, about the empty house and the grave, and the nothing waiting for her there. She thought about the money in the lockbox, about how she could take it and go anywhere. California, maybe, or back east to one of the big cities where a woman alone might find work. She thought about Talon's dark eyes and careful distance and the way he'd said respect in return for respect, like it was a prayer. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box along with the key. She closed the lid and set it back on the chest of drawers. She wasn't ready to decide yet, but she was beginning to understand the choice in front of her, and it was more complicated than she'd thought. Talon returned in the late afternoon looking tired and troubled. He unsaddled Skye, brushed her down, and came inside without a word. Eleanor had made a simple dinner, beans and cornbread, basic food from the pantry, and had it waiting on the table. He stopped when he saw it, surprise crossing his face. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Eleanor said, "but we both need to eat." They sat across from each other at the small table, and for a few minutes there was only the sound of eating, of spoons against tin plates. Then Talon spoke. "The meeting didn't go well. There's talk of more restrictions on Apache movement, more pressure to move on to reservations. Some of the younger warriors want to fight. The elders want to negotiate. I'm caught in the middle, trying to translate not just words but intentions, and no one trusts me completely because I'm living here instead of with the tribe." He said it matter-of-factly, but Eleanor could hear the weight behind the words. The loneliness of being caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Is that why you agreed to the marriage? She asked quietly. To prove something to them? Talon looked at her, and for the first time she saw something raw in his expression. Partly. The territorial governor thought it would help. A symbolic union, proof that we can coexist peacefully. But also, he paused. Also because I'm tired of being alone. Tired of living in this space between worlds with no one to share it with. I thought maybe if I had a partner, someone who understood what it meant to not quite belong anywhere, it might be easier. So you sent for a mail-order bride. So I agreed when they suggested it, Talon corrected. I didn't think anyone would actually respond. When your telegram came, I was surprised. Desperate people do desperate things, Eleanor said. Yes, Talon agreed. They do. He set down his spoon. Did you open the box? Eleanor nodded. And I'm still here, she said simply. Something shifted in Talon's face. Not quite a smile, but close. For now. For now, Eleanor echoed. Said. The next morning, Talon asked if she wanted to ride with him to visit his mother's camp. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of meeting Apache people, of being surrounded by strangers who would surely hate her for being white, for being the outsider who'd married one of their own, was terrifying. But something in Talon's face when he asked made her reconsider. He looked hopeful in a guarded way, like he was bracing for rejection but hoping for acceptance. All right, she heard herself say. They rode east again, this time for hours, deeper into country that grew more remote with every mile. The landscape changed gradually, becoming rockier, more mountainous. Eleanor clung to Talon's waist and tried not to think about how far from civilization they were getting, how completely dependent she was on this man she barely knew. Finally, as the sun reached its peak, they came over a ridge and Eleanor saw it, an Apache camp spread out in a valley below. Not the permanent village she'd somehow expected, but a collection of brush shelters called wickiups, arranged in loose clusters near a stream. Horses grazed nearby. Smoke rose from cooking fires. People moved between the structures with the easy rhythm of daily life. Eleanor's chest tightened with fear. They know we're coming, Talon said quietly. I sent word yesterday. They won't hurt you, Eleanor. You're under my protection, and that means something to them. What if they don't accept me? Then we'll leave. But give them a chance first. They're not what you've been told they are. They rode down into the valley, and Eleanor felt dozens of eyes turned toward them. Women paused in their work. Children stopped playing. Warriors stood from where they'd been sitting and watched with expressions Eleanor couldn't read. Talon dismounted and helped Eleanor down, then led her toward the largest wickiup at the center of the camp. An older woman emerged, her hair streaked with gray, her face weathered but strong. She wore traditional Apache dress, a long skirt and tunic decorated with intricate beadwork. Her eyes, the same dark brown as Talon's, swept over Eleanor with an intensity that made her want to step backward. Talon spoke to the woman in Apache, the language flowing smooth and musical from his lips. The woman responded, her voice sharp, questioning. They went back and forth for several exchanges, while Eleanor stood there feeling exposed and foolish. Finally, Talon turned to her. Eleanor, this is my mother, Nalin. Her name means maiden. Mother, this is my wife, Eleanor. Nalin looked at Eleanor for a long moment, then said something in Apache that sounded like it might have been a question. She wants to know if you came willingly or if I stole you. Talon translated, something that might have been amusement in his voice. Eleanor's eyes widened. Tell her I came willingly. Mostly, Talon translated. Nalin's expression softened slightly. She stepped forward and took Eleanor's hands in hers. They were rough with work, warm and strong, and studied her face with an intensity that felt like it was looking straight into her soul. Then Nalin spoke again, gentler this time. She says you look like you've known hardship, Talon said. She says that's good. Soft people don't survive out here. She says you may sit at her fire and eat with her, if you wish. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it wasn't rejection either. Eleanor nodded. Tell her thank you. Tell her I'm honored. The ghost of a smile crossed Nalin's face when Talon translated. She gestured toward the wickiup, inviting them inside. The interior of the wickiup was dim and cooler than outside, the brush walls providing shade and ventilation. Woven mats covered the ground. A small fire burned in the center, smoke escaping through an opening at the top. It was simple but comfortable, arranged with the kind of efficiency that came from people who'd perfected living with only what they needed. Nalin directed Eleanor to sit, then set about preparing food. Some kind of bread cooked on hot stones, dried meat, and a stew made with unfamiliar ingredients that smelled surprisingly good. As she worked, she spoke to Talon in Apache, rapid and fluid, occasionally glancing at Eleanor. "What's she saying?" Eleanor asked quietly. "She's telling me I should have warned you better about what you were agreeing to," Talon said. "She's saying the White Towns will treat you like a traitor, and my people will treat you like a curiosity. She's asking if I've thought about what that means for you." "What did you tell her?" "That you're stronger than you look," Talon said, "and that you had a choice." Nalin set bowls of food in front of them, then sat down herself and fixed Eleanor with another of those penetrating stares. She spoke again, this time directly to Eleanor, even though she knew Eleanor couldn't understand. Talon translated. "She says the Apache people have many enemies, the Mexicans who hunt us for bounty, the Americans who want our land, other tribes who remember old wars. She says if you stay with me, you'll make those enemies yours. She asks if you understand this." Eleanor met Nalin's gaze and tried to put conviction in her voice. "Tell her I understand. Tell her I've lost everything I had before, so I don't have much left to lose." When Talon translated, something shifted in Nalin's expression. She nodded slowly, then said something that sounded almost approving. "She says you speak like someone who knows what it means to survive," Talon said. "She says that's the most important skill for a woman in this life." They ate in silence for a while. The food better than Eleanor had expected. The bread was slightly sweet, the stew savory and filling. Through the wickiup entrance, she could see Apache women moving about the camp, could hear children laughing, could smell smoke and horses in the dry earth. It was all so foreign, so completely different from anything she'd ever known, and yet there was something oddly familiar about it too. The rhythms of daily life, women working together, children playing, men gathered in serious discussion, the human elements that existed regardless of culture or language. After they'd eaten, Nalin gestured for Eleanor to follow her outside. Talon stayed behind, talking with some of the men who'd gathered near the wickiup. Warriors, Eleanor guessed, from the way they carried themselves and the weapons at their sides. Nalin led Eleanor toward where the women were working, tanning a hide stretched on a frame. They looked up as the two approached, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile to carefully blank. Nalin spoke to them in Apache, gesturing to Eleanor. One of the younger women responded with something that sounded challenging. Nalin's voice sharpened, and the woman fell silent, looking away. "She wants to know if you know how to work," a voice said in accented English. Eleanor turned to find a girl of perhaps 15, watching her with intelligent eyes. "I'm Kaya. I learned English at the mission school with Talon before he left. My mother wants to know if you can do useful things or if you're just a decoration." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "I can work. I can sew, cook, clean. I can learn other things." Kaya translated. Nalin nodded and said something else. "She says anyone can cook and clean. Can you work leather? Can you weave? Can you make medicine from plants?" "No," Eleanor admitted. "But I can learn." Kaya translated again. This time, one of the other women spoke up. An older woman with kind eyes and capable hands. She gestured to the hide they were working on, then mimed the scraping motion they were using. "Desba says she'll teach you," Kaya said, "if you want to learn." Eleanor looked at the hide, at the hard physical work involved in scraping away the flesh and fat, and felt her stomach turn slightly. But she nodded. "Yes, I want to learn." Desba handed her a scraping tool, bone or antler, Eleanor couldn't tell which, and showed her the motion. Eleanor tried to copy it, her movements awkward and inefficient. The women watched, some with amusement, some with something that might have been pity. But Desba was patient, correcting Eleanor's grip, showing her again and again until she started to get the rhythm right. It was exhausting work, her arms burning within minutes, but Eleanor kept at it, determined not to give up in front of these women who were judging her with every stroke. After a while, Nalin spoke again, this time with something that might have been approval in her voice. "She says you don't give up easily," Kaya translated. "She says that's good. You'll need that stubbornness to survive as Talon's wife." Eleanor wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Tell her I've had a lot of practice at surviving things I wasn't prepared for." Kaya's eyes widened slightly when she translated, and Nalin actually smiled, a small smile, barely there, but real. The women went back to work, and Eleanor worked alongside them, her arms screaming in protest, her hands already forming blisters. But no one told her to stop. No one sent her away. They just let her work, correcting her when needed, ignoring her when she didn't need help. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was a beginning. They stayed at the camp for 3 days. Talon met with the elders and warriors, translating, negotiating, trying to find paths forward that wouldn't end in bloodshed. Eleanor worked with the women, learning skills that made her hands raw and her back ache, but also gave her a strange sense of accomplishment. She learned which plants could be eaten and which were poison. She learned how to scrape a hide properly, how to soften leather by working it with stones and fat. She learned a handful of Apache words, basic things like water and food and thank you, and the women seemed pleased when she tried to use them, even if her pronunciation was terrible. Kaya became something like a friend, or at least a guide. She was bright and curious, asking Eleanor endless questions about life in Kansas, about white towns, about why she'd agreed to marry Talon. "Did you love him?" Kaya asked one afternoon as they gathered wood for the fires. "No," Eleanor said honestly. "I didn't even know him." "Then why marry him?" Eleanor considered how to explain it. "Because I had nothing left, and he offered me something, not love, but a chance. Sometimes that's enough." Kaya nodded thoughtfully. "Talon is a good man, caught between worlds like me. The whites don't trust him because he's Apache. The Apache don't fully trust him because he speaks their language and wears their clothes and lives in their houses. It's lonely being between." "Is that why he came back, to be less lonely?" "Maybe," Kaya said. "Or maybe to remember who he is. The mission school tried to make him white, tried to make all of us white. Some of us forgot ourselves. Talon never did, but he learned to speak both languages, walk in both worlds. Now he uses that to try to keep his people safe." She looked at Eleanor seriously. "You make it harder for him, you know, a white wife. Some of the warriors think he's betrayed us. Some of the elders think he's trying to build a bridge. Everyone watches to see which it is." The weight of that settled on Eleanor's shoulders. She wasn't just Talon's wife. She was a symbol, a statement, a political gesture made flesh. Every action she took would be interpreted, judged, used as evidence for one side or another. It was exhausting just thinking about it. On the third night, Nalin invited them to eat at her fire again. This time, other families joined them. Desba and her husband, Kaya and her mother, several others. They sat in a circle as darkness fell and the stars came out in their thousands. And Nalin told stories in Apache while Talon quietly translated for Eleanor. Stories of the Apache people, of their long history in these mountains, of heroes and tricksters, and the way the world came to be. Eleanor listened, fascinated despite herself, drawn into the rhythms of the language and the power of the tales. When the stories ended, one of the warriors, a man named Goyathle, who'd been watching Eleanor with barely concealed suspicion since they'd arrived, spoke directly to her in halting English. "You stay with him?" he asked, jerking his chin toward Talon. "When soldiers come? When white towns hate you?" Eleanor felt everyone watching her, waiting for her answer. She looked at Talon, who met her eyes with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then she looked back at Goyathle. "I don't know what the future holds," she said slowly. "But I'm here now, and I don't run from things just because they're hard." Goyathle stared at her for a long moment, then grunted something that might have been approval or might have been dismissal. But he didn't challenge her further. Nalin spoke then, her voice carrying authority. Talon translated. "My mother says that actions speak louder than words. She says time will show what kind of woman you are. She says she hopes you're strong enough for what's coming. So do I, Eleanor said quietly. Mukad. They rode back to Talon's house the next morning, leaving early to avoid the worst heat of the day. Eleanor's hands were blistered and bandaged, her muscles sore from unfamiliar work, but she felt oddly satisfied. She'd survived 3 days among the Apache. She'd learned things. She'd earned, if not acceptance, at least acknowledgement. As they rode, Talon was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. Your mother is impressive. Talon glanced back at her. She is. She survived things that would have broken most people. The Apache wars, the loss of my father, watching our way of life slowly disappear. But she keeps going, keeps her people together. She doesn't approve of me. She doesn't disapprove either. That's something. My mother judges people by their actions, not their words or their blood. If you prove yourself worthy, she'll accept you. If not, he shrugged. And the others? Mixed feelings. Some see you as evidence that I've abandoned my people. Others see you as proof that peace is possible. Most are just waiting to see what happens. He paused. What did you think of them? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I think they're people. Just people. Trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast. Not so different from anyone else, really. Talon's shoulders relaxed slightly. That's more understanding than most whites show. I'm learning, Eleanor said, that most of what I was taught about the world was wrong, or at least incomplete. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Eleanor asked the question that had been building in her mind for days. What happens now? With the territorial restrictions, with the pressure to move to reservations? What are your people going to do? Talon's hands tightened slightly on the reins. I don't know. The elders want to negotiate, find a way to maintain some autonomy, even within the reservation system. The warriors want to fight, to resist until the end. I'm trying to help them find a middle path, but I'm not sure one exists. The territorial government wants the Apache gone. Dead or contained, they don't much care which. Every negotiation feels like just delaying the inevitable. And you're caught in the middle. Always, Talon said quietly, always between. Never fully trusted by either side. It's why the marriage was supposed to help. Proof that I could bridge both worlds, that integration was possible. But I'm starting to think it just made me more suspect to everyone. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. She was part of that burden now, another complication in his already complicated life. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. I made the choice. We both did. We'll face the consequences together, whatever they are. Together. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Eleanor wasn't ready to examine too closely. When they reached the house, the sun was high and brutal. Talon helped Eleanor down from Sky, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary before he released her. You did well, he said, at the camp, with my mother and the women. You surprised them. Surprised me too, if I'm honest. How so? Most white women would have run screaming, or at least refused to work, insisted on being treated like a guest instead of one of the community. But you just tried, even when it was hard, even when you clearly had no idea what you were doing. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. I told you I don't run from hard things. No, Talon agreed, something warm in his eyes. You don't. But they stood there in the dusty yard, the house waiting behind them, and Eleanor felt the space between them shift somehow, become less like the distance between strangers and more like the space between two people who were beginning, tentatively, to understand each other. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship yet. But it was something, a foundation maybe, on which something more could eventually be built, if they survived long enough to build it. That night, as Eleanor lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the desert darkness, she thought about the key in the wooden box. The key that meant freedom, meant escape, meant she could leave all of this behind if she chose. She thought about Kansas and her father's grave and the nothing waiting for her there. She thought about Tucson and the look she'd get from townspeople who saw her as a traitor to her race. She thought about the Apache camp and Nalin's penetrating gaze and the way the women had let her work beside them despite having every reason to reject her. She thought about Talon, about the careful respect he showed her, about the way he'd given her the power to leave and asked for nothing in return except her presence if she chose to stay. And she realized that for the first time since her father died, she wasn't entirely sure what she wanted. The uncertainty should have frightened her, but instead, it felt almost like hope. In the other room, Talon lay awake too, staring at the darkness and thinking about the white woman sleeping in his house. His wife, on paper at least, though what that meant in practice was still undefined. He'd seen the way she'd worked at his mother's camp, the way she'd pushed through obvious discomfort and pain to prove herself. He'd seen the determination in her eyes when Goyatle had challenged her, the steady way she'd met his gaze and refused to back down. She was stronger than he'd expected. Braver, too. And that complicated things in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd offered her freedom because he'd meant what he said. Marriage should be a choice, not a trap. But now, watching her begin to find her place in his world, he found himself hoping she'd choose to stay. Not because he needed a political symbol or a housekeeper, but because he was beginning to want her presence for its own sake. That was dangerous. Wanting things, caring about outcomes. Those were luxuries he couldn't afford. Not when his position was so precarious, when every decision he made affected not just himself but his entire people. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the house they shared, Talon couldn't quite make himself stop wanting. Outside, the desert night stretched on, vast and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath its stars. And in the distance, storm clouds were gathering that would test everything these two people were tentatively building together. But that storm was still days away. For now, there was just the quiet house and two people slowly learning to inhabit the same space, to speak the same language, to become something more than strangers bound by circumstance. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The storm came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Eleanor's visit to Nalin's camp. But it wasn't the kind of storm that brought rain. Eleanor had fallen into a rhythm by then, a pattern of days that felt almost normal if she didn't think too hard about how strange her life had become. She woke early, made coffee the way Talon had shown her, strong and bitter, the Apache way. They ate breakfast together in companionable silence. Then Talon would ride out to whatever meeting or negotiation demanded his presence, and Eleanor would spend her days working on the skills Desba and the other women had begun teaching her. She was getting better at tanning hides, her hands toughening up, the motions becoming more natural. She'd started a small herb garden near the house, planting the medicinal plants Nalin had taught her to identify. She practiced the Apache words Kaya had taught her, repeating them aloud until her pronunciation improved from terrible to merely bad. And in the evenings, she and Talon would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the distant mountains, talking about small things, the day's work, the weather, stories from their vastly different childhoods. They talked around the bigger questions, the ones neither of them seemed ready to address, questions like what their marriage really was, or what it might become, or whether Eleanor would ever use that key sitting in the carved box. It wasn't intimacy exactly, but it was something. A growing comfort with each other's presence, a tentative trust being built one careful conversation at a time. Eleanor had almost started to believe it might last. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. She was working in the garden when she heard the horses. Not just one or two, but many, the sound of riders moving fast and hard. Eleanor straightened up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, her heart already starting to race with an instinct that something was wrong. Talon had ridden out that morning to meet with a group of ranchers who'd complained about Apache raiders stealing cattle. He'd been tense before he left, more worried than usual. "The ranchers are angry," he'd said. "They want someone to blame, and the Apache are convenient targets. I'm going to try to convince them that punishing the whole tribe for the actions of a few desperate young men won't solve anything." "Will they listen?" Eleanor had asked. "Probably not," Talon had admitted, "but I have to try." Now, watching the dust cloud on the horizon grow closer, Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Something had gone very wrong. She ran toward the house, not sure what she was planning to do, but knowing she needed to get inside, needed to be somewhere defensible. But before she reached the door, the riders crested the rise and she saw them clearly. White men. 5 of them. heavily armed, their faces hard with anger and something uglier. They saw her and changed direction, heading straight for the house. Eleanor's mind raced. She could lock herself inside, but that wouldn't stop them if they were determined. She could run, but they'd catch her easily on horseback. She could... The lead rider pulled up his horse just yards from where she stood, close enough that she could see the hatred in his eyes. "You the Indian's whore?" he asked, his voice thick with contempt. Eleanor's chin came up despite the fear coursing through her. "I'm Eleanor Greyhawk. This is my home. What do you want?" The man spat in the dirt. "Your home. That's rich. You're living in sin with a savage, and you call it a home." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Where is he? Where's the Apache translator?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, girl. We know he lives here. We know he's been stirring up the Indians, helping them steal our cattle, probably planning worse. Where is he?" Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Talon hasn't stolen anything. He's been trying to negotiate peace, trying to prevent exactly the kind of violence you're—" "Peace," the man sneered. "There's only one kind of peace with Indians, and that's the peace of the grave. Now you tell us where he is, or we'll make this real unpleasant for you." Before Eleanor could respond, one of the other riders spoke up. "She don't know, Chet. She's just a stupid girl who got tricked into marrying a savage. Leave her be." But Chet shook his head. "She made her choice. She married him. She lives with him. She's as guilty as he is." His eyes raked over Eleanor with disgust. "Probably enjoying it too. The little—" "Get off my property," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with fury she couldn't quite control. "You have no right to be here, no right to threaten me. Leave. Now." Chet laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You hear that, boys? She's giving us orders. The Indian's whore thinks she's somebody." He swung down from his horse and took a step toward Eleanor. "Maybe we ought to teach her some manners, show her what happens to white women who forget their place." Eleanor backed up, her heart hammering, her mind frantically searching for options. She was alone, unarmed, facing 5 armed men who clearly had no intention of leaving peacefully. This was going to end badly no matter what she did, but maybe if she could just delay them, keep them talking until... A gunshot cracked through the air. Everyone froze. Eleanor's eyes darted toward the sound and saw Talon standing at the edge of the property, his rifle raised, his face a mask of controlled fury. "The next one goes through your head, Chet," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Get away from my wife." Chet's hand moved toward his gun, but Talon's rifle tracked the movement. "Don't. You're not fast enough, and we both know it." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Chet slowly raised his hands. "This ain't over, half-breed. You and your Apache friends have been stealing from us, and we're done asking nicely." "My people haven't touched your cattle," Talon said, "but some outlaws running guns have been using Apache signs to cover their tracks. I told you this at the meeting. I offered to help you find the real thieves. You didn't want to hear it." "Liar," Chet spat. "You're all liars. You think we don't know what you're planning? You think we're going to sit back and let you savages murder us in our beds?" "Nobody's planning to murder anyone," Talon said, but there was an edge of frustration in his voice now. "If you just listen." That's when Eleanor heard it. More horses, coming fast from the opposite direction. She turned and her blood went cold. Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, riding hard toward the house. Leading them was Goyatle, the warrior who'd questioned her at Nalin's camp, his face painted for war. "Talon," Eleanor breathed, but he'd already seen them. His expression shifted from controlled anger to something close to panic. "No," he said under his breath. "No, not now. Don't!" Goyatle and his warriors pulled up in a semicircle, effectively surrounding Chet and his men. The white ranchers' hands went to their guns, and suddenly everyone was armed, everyone was aiming at everyone else, and Eleanor was standing in the middle of it all knowing that one wrong move would turn this into a bloodbath. Talon stepped forward, positioning himself between the two groups, his rifle still raised but not pointed at anyone in particular. He spoke in rapid Apache to Goyatle, his voice urgent, pleading. Goyatle responded harshly, gesturing at the white men with barely contained rage. Even without understanding the words, Eleanor could grasp the meaning. These men had threatened Talon, threatened his home, and Goyatle wanted blood for it. Everyone needs to calm down, Talon said in English, then repeated it in Apache. This doesn't have to end in violence. Chet, you and your men are going to get on your horses and leave. Goyethle, you and the warriors are going to let them go. Nobody fires a shot, nobody gets hurt, we all walk away. They threatened your woman, Goyethle said in his halting English, his eyes never leaving Chet. Apache law says they die for that. White law says you die for being here at all, Chet shot back. You're off the reservation, you're armed, that's enough to hang every one of you. The tension ratcheted higher. Fingers tightened on triggers. Eleanor could see it spiraling, could see how quickly this would turn into exactly the kind of violence Talon had been trying to prevent. She did the only thing she could think of. She walked directly into the middle of the standoff, positioning herself where both groups could see her clearly. Stop, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. All of you, just stop and think for 1 second. Eleanor, get back, Talon said urgently, but she ignored him, looking instead at Goyethle. You said time would show what kind of woman I am. You said my actions would speak louder than words. Well, I'm telling you now, if you kill these men, you'll start a war. The territorial government will use it as an excuse to send in the army. Your people, Talon's mother, all the children in the camp, they'll be hunted down. Is that what you want? Goyethle's jaw clenched, but he didn't lower his weapon. Eleanor turned to Chet. And you came here looking for someone to blame, someone to punish for crimes you can't even prove the Apache committed. But killing Talon won't get your cattle back. It won't make you safer. It'll just make you murderers. Get out of the way, girl, Chet growled. No, Eleanor said, because if you start shooting, I'll be the first one hit. And then this stops being about cattle or territory or pride. It becomes about killing an unarmed white woman. Is that what you want to explain to the territorial judge? She could see Chet hesitating, could see the calculation in his eyes. Killing an Apache translator in a standoff was one thing. Killing a white woman in the crossfire was another matter entirely. Lower your weapons, Talon said into the silence. All of you. Chet, take your men and go. Goyethle, I give you my word these men will face justice if they've committed crimes. But not like this. Not here. Not now. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nobody moved. Then one of the ranchers, the one who'd suggested leaving Eleanor alone earlier, slowly lowered his rifle. Chet, he said quietly, the girl's right. This ain't worth it. Chet's face twisted with fury, but he slowly, reluctantly nodded. This ain't over, he said again, but he was already backing toward his horse. You tell your savage friends they've got 1 week to return our cattle, or we're coming back with the law, or without it. He swung into his saddle, and his men followed. They rode off fast, glancing back as if expecting to be shot in the back. Goyethle watched them go with murderous eyes, then turned to Talon and spoke in Apache, his tone sharp with accusation. Talon responded in the same language, his voice weary but firm. They argued back and forth for several minutes, while Eleanor stood there, her legs shaking with delayed reaction, wondering if she'd just made things better or infinitely worse. Finally, Goyethle made a disgusted sound and gestured to his warriors. They wheeled their horses and rode off, but not before Goyethle fixed Eleanor with a look she couldn't read, respect, maybe, or anger, or both. When they were gone, Eleanor's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the dust, her whole body trembling. Talon was beside her in an instant, kneeling down, his hands on her shoulders. Are you all right? Did they hurt you? I'm fine, Eleanor managed. Just scared. What did Goyethle say? Talon's jaw tightened. That I'm a fool for trusting white men's justice. That I should have let him kill Chet and his friends and be done with it. That protecting white law above Apache honor makes me a traitor. What did you tell him? That killing them would have gotten his people slaughtered. That I'm trying to prevent a war, not start one. That... He paused. That you showed more courage standing between two groups of armed men than most warriors show in battle. He didn't like hearing it, but he couldn't deny it either. Eleanor looked up at him, at the strain in his face, the weight he carried. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have interfered, but I couldn't just stand there and watch. You saved lives today, Talon interrupted. On both sides. You... He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. You risked yourself for my people, even though you barely know them, even though they haven't fully accepted you. Why? Eleanor thought about it. Because they're your people. And you're my husband. That makes them my people too, doesn't it? Something shifted in Talon's expression, something deep and raw. He helped her to her feet, his hands gentle but lingering. We need to leave, he said abruptly. Tonight. Chet meant what he said. They'll be back, probably with more men. And Goyatle is young and angry and doesn't understand the consequences of his actions. If he decides to strike first, to attack the ranchers or their families, he shook his head. I need to get you somewhere safe. Then I need to ride to my mother's camp, try to convince the elders to control the young warriors before this spirals. Where? Eleanor asked. Where's safe? Tucson, maybe. Or... He hesitated. There's a place in the mountains, a hidden valley my people use when they need to disappear. I could take you there, to my mother. She'd protect you. Eleanor's mind was reeling. Everything was happening too fast, the fragile peace she'd thought they were building crumbling like sand. What about you? I'll do what I always do. Try to negotiate. Try to find a middle path between men who only want blood. He started toward the house, already planning, already shifting into the role of mediator and peacemaker. But Eleanor didn't follow. Something had crystallized in her mind during the standoff, something she needed to understand before they went any further. Talon, wait. He turned back. The box you gave me, she said. The key. You said I should open it when I'd decided what kind of marriage this was going to be. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Eleanor interrupted. Because whatever happens next, whatever danger we're riding into, I need you to know. I need to tell you before... She took a breath. I'm staying, not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because I'm trapped, but because I choose to. I choose this. I choose you. Talon stood very still. You don't have to decide now. Not under pressure, not when... I'm not deciding under pressure, Eleanor said. I decided days ago, maybe weeks ago, I don't know, somewhere between your mother's camp and learning to scrape hides and sitting on the porch with you watching the sunset. I needed you to know, in case something happens, in case we don't get another chance to talk about it. For a long moment, Talon just looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face like he was trying to memorize it. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. It was the first time he'd really touched her, held her like she was something precious, instead of something fragile he was afraid to break. Eleanor felt the solid warmth of him, the strength in his arms, the way his heart was racing against her cheek. Eleanor, he said into her hair, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before, something vulnerable and honest and terrified. If anything happens to you because of me, because of this, then we face it together, she said firmly. That's what choosing means, doesn't it? You don't get to protect me by pushing me away. We're in this together now. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, and Eleanor saw in his eyes that he understood what she was really saying, that this wasn't about politics or survival anymore, that somewhere along the way, this arrangement had become real. We need to pack, he said finally, his voice rough. Quickly, take only what you can carry. We ride in an hour. Eleanor nodded and started to turn toward the house, but Talon caught her hand. The key, he said. In the box. I want you to take it with you. Keep it. The money is still yours, Eleanor. That doesn't change just because you've chosen to stay. It's insurance, a way out, if you ever need one. Promise me you'll keep it. Talon, promise me. She saw in his face that this mattered to him, that he needed her to have that escape route even as she was choosing not to use it, so she nodded. I promise. Inside the house, they moved with urgent efficiency. Eleanor packed her few possessions into a canvas bag, clothes, the carved box with its key, her mother's cameo brooch. Talon gathered supplies, food and water and ammunition, his movements practiced and grim. They were almost ready when Eleanor heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. Horses again, many horses, coming fast from multiple directions. Talon, she said, her voice tight with fear. He was at the window in an instant, looking out, and Eleanor saw his face go hard as stone. Outlaws, the ones who've been raiding the ranches and blaming it on the Apache. They must have been watching, waiting for an opportunity. How many? Too many. He grabbed his rifle, checked the ammunition. Eleanor, listen to me carefully. There's a root cellar under the floorboards in the bedroom. Hide there. Don't come out no matter what you hear. When it's safe, ride Sky to my mother's camp. She'll know what to do. I'm not leaving you. You have to, Talon said urgently. The sound of horses was getting closer. They'll kill me, Eleanor. I know too much about their operation, and I've been trying to expose them. But they might leave alone. You're a white woman. You're innocent in this. Hide, stay quiet, and survive, please. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but the terror in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about bravery or standing together. This was about cold tactical reality. Go, Talon said, and there was no time to argue anymore because suddenly the door was being kicked in and men were flooding into the house. Rough men with guns and cruel faces, men who'd clearly come for violence. Eleanor ran for this bedroom as gunfire exploded behind her. She could hear Talon fighting, could hear him taking down at least two of them before they overwhelmed him. She wanted to turn back, wanted to help, but his voice in her head kept saying, "Survive, survive, survive." She found the root cellar entrance, pulled up the floorboards with shaking hands, and dropped down into the darkness below. Above her, she could hear boots pounding, furniture breaking, Talon shouting something defiant before a sickening thud silenced him. Eleanor pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to the outlaws ransacking the house above her. "Where's the woman?" one of them shouted. "Chet said there was a woman." "Probably ran when she heard us coming," another voice answered. "Don't matter, we got what we came for. Tie him up and let's move." "What about the house?" "Burn it. Send a message to any other Indians thinking about settling on white land." No, 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 no. Eleanor's mind raced. They were going to burn the house with her in it. She'd suffocate in the smoke or burn alive, and they'd never even know she was here. She heard them dragging Talon out, heard his body thump against the steps. Heard one of them laugh about how the Apache translator wouldn't be translating anymore. Heard them splashing something, oil probably, around the room above her. Then she smelled smoke. Eleanor's survival instinct kicked in. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out, had to find help, had to save Talon before they killed him. She pushed up on the floorboards carefully, listening. The smoke was already thick, flames spreading fast across the oil-soaked floor. Through the haze, she could see the outlaws had left. She could hear horses outside, riding away. Eleanor climbed out of the cellar, coughing, her eyes streaming. The house was going up fast, flames eating through the dry wood like it was kindling. She had seconds, maybe, before the whole structure collapsed. She grabbed her canvas bag from where she'd dropped it, grabbed Talon's rifle that had been knocked under the table, and ran for the door. Outside, the air was clear but tainted with smoke. Eleanor gasped it in, looking around desperately. The outlaws were riding east toward the desert. She could see them clearly, 8 men on horseback, and one horse in the middle carrying a body tied across its back. Talon. Eleanor's hands shook as she ran to the corral where Sky waited, already nervous from the smoke and noise. She managed to get a saddle on the horse, barely, her fingers fumbling with straps and buckles, and pulled herself into the saddle. Behind her, the house collapsed in on itself with a roar of flames and sparks. Everything Talon had built, everything they'd started to build together, gone in minutes. But Eleanor didn't look back. She kicked Sky into a gallop and rode after the outlaws, after her husband, into the darkening desert. She had no plan, no weapons except the rifle she barely knew how to use, no backup, no help, no realistic hope of success. But she'd meant what she'd told Talon. They were in this together now, and she wasn't about to let him die alone in the desert while she hid like a coward. So Eleanor rode, pushing Sky hard, following the dust cloud the outlaws had left behind. The sun was setting, painting the sky blood red, and somewhere ahead of her the man she'd chosen to build a life with was riding toward his execution. She didn't know how she'd save him, but she knew with absolute certainty that she'd try or die trying. The thought should have terrified her, but all Eleanor felt was a cold, clear determination. She'd been Eleanor Price once, a scared girl who'd lost everything. Then she'd been Eleanor Greyhawk in name only, A political gesture, a convenience. But riding into the desert after armed outlaws to save her husband, she was finally, truly, herself. A woman who'd made a choice and would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. The desert stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving. Night was falling fast, and Eleanor rode on, following the trail, following her heart, following the thread of hope that said maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. Behind her, the burning house sent up a column of smoke that could be seen for miles. A signal fire that would bring help, eventually. But eventually might be too late. So Eleanor rode faster, whispering promises to the darkening sky. Promises that she'd find him, that she'd save him, that they'd finish the conversation they'd started about what their marriage could be. And somewhere in the desert ahead, Talon hung half-conscious across a horse's back and wondered if the white woman he'd married would survive what was coming. He'd given her the key, given her freedom, given her every chance to escape. But he hadn't counted on one thing, that she might actually care enough to follow, that she might actually choose him over safety, over sense, over every instinct that said to run. The outlaws rode on, confident in their victory, unaware that behind them came a 19-year-old woman with terror in her heart and steel in her spine. And the night came down like a curtain, hiding everything in shadow and stars. The desert at night was a different world entirely, full of sounds Eleanor had never heard, and shadows that moved with purposes she couldn't guess. Sky's hooves struck rock and sand in an uneven rhythm, and Eleanor clung to the saddle with aching hands, her eyes straining to follow the trail the outlaws had left. The moon rose late, a thin crescent that gave barely enough light to see by. Eleanor had to slow down, terrified of riding Sky into a gully or off a cliff she couldn't see in the darkness. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, every delay another step closer to Talon's death. She'd been riding for perhaps 2 hours when she smelled it, smoke, different from the house fire, the sharp scent of a campfire. Eleanor's heart leaped. She pulled Sky to a stop and dismounted, her legs nearly buckling after the hard ride. Leading the horse carefully, she moved toward the smell, toward a faint orange glow visible between two rock formations ahead. As she got closer, she could hear voices. Rough laughter, the kind men made when they felt safe and victorious. Eleanor's stomach churned with rage and fear in equal measure. She tied Sky to a scraggly bush far enough back that the horse wouldn't be seen, then crept forward on foot, staying low, moving as quietly as she could. The Apache women had taught her some things about moving through wilderness without being detected, where to step, how to control her breathing, how to use shadow and stillness. She used all of it now, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they'd hear it. The outlaws had made camp in a small canyon, sheltered on 3 sides by rock walls. Their fire burned bright and careless in the center, and around it sat 7 men, 1 fewer than Eleanor had counted before. She scanned the camp desperately until she found what she was looking for. Talon lay on the ground near the far edge of the firelight, his hands bound behind his back, his feet tied together. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see blood on his face, could see the way he lay too still, either unconscious or close to it. Her breath caught in her throat. "Should have killed him at the house," one of the outlaws was saying, a heavy-set man with a beard. "Dragging him all the way out here is a waste of time." "Boss wants him alive until he talks," another man replied. This one thin and wiry with a cruel mouth. "Wants to know if the Apache know about the guns we've been running through their territory. If they do, we need to know before we make the next shipment." "He won't talk," a third man said. "Apaches don't break easy, and this one's got white man education on top of Apache stubbornness. We could torture him all night and get nothing." The thin man grinned. "Then we torture him all night anyway. Chet wants him to suffer before he dies. Something about disrespecting his authority in front of the men." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. These men weren't just outlaws. They were gun runners, using Apache raids as cover for their illegal operations. They'd framed Talon's people, stirred up hatred between the ranchers and the Apache, all to protect their criminal enterprise. And now they were going to torture and kill the one man who'd been trying to expose them. Not if she could help it. But what could she do? She was one woman with a rifle she barely knew how to shoot, facing 7 armed men who killed for a living. Charging in would just get her killed alongside Talon. She needed a plan, needed an advantage, needed something they wouldn't expect. She needed help. Eleanor backed away from the camp carefully, her mind racing. The Apache. Goyathle and his warriors had been nearby earlier. If she could find them, if she could convince them to help, they'd have a chance. But how would she find them in the dark? How would she communicate? How would she convince them to trust her, a white woman, when they'd made it clear they barely tolerated her existence? She was heading back toward Sky when she heard the sound. A soft whistle, barely audible, coming from the rocks to her left. Eleanor froze, her heart in her throat. The whistle came again, followed by a low voice speaking in Apache. Eleanor's eyes had adjusted to the darkness enough to make out a figure standing in the shadow of a boulder, tall, armed, watching her. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered in English, then tried one of the few Apache phrases she knew. Friend. Talon, friend." The figure stepped forward slightly, and moonlight caught his face. Goyathle. The young warrior was here, and he wasn't alone. Eleanor could see other shapes in the darkness now, at least 6 or 7 more warriors positioned around the canyon. They'd been following. Following Talon or following the outlaws, Eleanor wasn't sure which, but they were here. Goyathle spoke again in Apache, his tone questioning. Eleanor gestured desperately toward the camp, toward where Talon lay bound. She pointed to the outlaws, made a slashing motion across her throat, tried to communicate danger, urgency, death. Then she remembered something Kaya had taught her, the Apache word for help. "Inda," she said, the word feeling clumsy in her mouth. Then she added the word for husband, Shikai, and put it together as best she could. "Shikai, help, please." Goyathle studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Then he made a gesture and melted back into the shadows. For a terrible second, Eleanor thought he was leaving, abandoning her and Talon to their fate, but then she felt a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. She turned to find an older warrior beside her, one she recognized from Nalin's camp. He gestured for her to follow, and they moved together through the darkness to where the other Apache had gathered. One of them spoke some English, enough to translate haltingly. His name was Cochise, named after the great chief, and his eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Goyathle asked why we help," Cochise said quietly. "These men, they are white problem. Why Apache die for Talon, who lives like white man?" Eleanor looked at Goyathle, meeting his eyes directly. "Because Talon is trying to protect your people. These men are gun runners. They steal cattle and blame the Apache. They want war between your people and the ranchers so nobody looks at them. If Talon dies, the truth dies with him. Your people will be hunted for crimes they didn't commit." Cochise translated. Goyathle's expression shifted, anger flickering across his face. He responded sharply. "He says he knows about the gun runners," Cochise translated. "Says Talon has been trying to prove this for months." "But how do you know? Why do you care?" "Because Talon is my husband," Eleanor said simply. "And what hurts him hurts me. What hurts your people hurts me. I chose this. I chose all of it." When Cochise translated, several of the warriors exchanged glances. Goyathle spoke again, longer this time, his tone less hostile. "He says you are either very brave or very stupid," Cochise said, and there might have been the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. "He says you stood between guns today to protect Apache and white alike. He says you work with Apache women, even though it hurts your soft hands. He says maybe you are worthy of Talon after all." He paused. "He asks, what is your plan?" Eleanor's mind raced. She had no real military experience, no tactical training, but she had something else. She had rage and desperation and the absolute certainty that she would not let these men kill her husband. "They think they're safe," she said slowly. "They think nobody knows where they are. We use that. Some of you create a distraction, make them think they're being attacked from one direction. While they're focused on that, the rest of us free Talon and get him out." Cochise translated. Goyathle listened, then shook his head and spoke rapidly. "He says you will stay here," Cochise translated. "Safe. Warriors will handle this." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Those men saw me at the house. If I show myself, it'll confuse them. They'll hesitate, trying to figure out how I got here, whether I'm alone. That hesitation could save lives. Goyatle's eyes narrowed. He spoke again, his tone challenging. He says you cannot fight. You cannot even shoot that rifle you carry. You will be killed, and Talon will watch you die. How does this help? Eleanor lifted her chin. I don't need to fight. I just need to be seen, to distract them long enough for your warriors to strike. And if I die, she swallowed hard. If I die trying to save him, at least he'll know I chose to stay, that I chose him. That matters. The translation seemed to affect Goyatle. He was quiet for a long moment, studying Eleanor's face in the faint moonlight. Then he nodded slowly and began giving orders in rapid Apache. The warriors moved to their positions with practiced silence. Cochise stayed with Eleanor, explaining the plan in whispered English. 4 warriors will attack from the east, make noise, draw the men's attention. Goyatle and 2 others will move in from the west, kill guards quickly, silent. You will walk from the south into the firelight. When the men see you, they will be confused, distracted. In that moment, we strike. And Talon? When fighting starts, cut his bonds. Get him away from the camp. We will cover your escape. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. It was a simple plan, which meant it could work or it could fail spectacularly. But it was all they had. Cochise squeezed her shoulder once, then disappeared into the darkness to take his position. Eleanor was left alone, crouched behind a boulder, counting her heartbeats and trying to steady her breathing. She thought about the carved box back in her canvas bag, about the letter inside it, about Talon's words. You are not my prisoner. You are a woman who deserves the dignity of choice. She'd made her choice. Now she had to see it through. The signal came as a bird call, so perfect that Eleanor almost missed it. Then chaos erupted on the eastern side of the canyon. War cries split the night, gunfire exploded, and the outlaws scrambled to their feet, grabbing weapons, shouting orders. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the boulder. She walked toward the firelight slowly, deliberately, making herself visible. The rifle was in her hands but pointed down. She wasn't trying to threaten, just trying to be seen. One of the outlaws saw her first. What the hell? It's the woman! How did she— Shoot her! Someone yelled. But they hesitated, just as Eleanor had predicted. Confused by her presence, trying to figure out if she was alone or if this was a trap. That hesitation cost them everything. Goyatle and his warriors struck from the shadows like ghosts. Silent and deadly, they took down 3 outlaws before the others even realized they were under attack from multiple sides. Gunfire lit up the night, bullets ricocheting off rock, men screaming. Eleanor ran toward Talon, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes were open now, wide with shock and pain, and something that might have been fear. Eleanor, he gasped. What are you? You need to run. You need to— Shut up, she said, her hands fumbling with the ropes binding his wrists. They were tied tight, and her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely work the knots. I'm getting you out of here. A bullet struck the ground inches from her leg, kicking up dirt. Eleanor flinched but kept working the ropes. Around them, the battle raged. Apache warriors and outlaws locked in close combat, the advantage shifting moment by moment. Finally, the knot gave way. Talon's hands came free, and he immediately reached for the bonds at his feet. Eleanor helped him, and together they got them loose. Talon tried to stand, but his legs buckled. They'd beaten him worse than Eleanor had realized. His face was bruised and swollen, his ribs probably broken from the way he was breathing. I can't, he started. You can, Eleanor said fiercely. She got her shoulder under his arm, taking as much of his weight as she could. We're leaving, together. Now move. They stumbled away from the firelight, toward the darkness and safety. Behind them, Eleanor heard Goyatle's voice shouting in Apache, heard the outlaws' return fire becoming more sporadic as they realized they were outmatched. Eleanor and Talon made it perhaps 50 yards before Talon's legs gave out completely. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and Talon coughed, a wet, painful sound that terrified Eleanor. Leave me, he gasped. Get to safety, Eleanor, please. Not a chance, she said, trying to pull him upright again. I didn't ride through the desert at night and walk into a camp of murderers just to leave you now. You're stuck with me, Greyhawk. Deal with it. Despite everything, The pain, the danger, the chaos. Talon laughed. It turned into another cough, but his eyes, when he looked at her, were warm with something that made Eleanor's chest ache. "Stubborn woman," he managed. "You married me," Eleanor pointed out. "Your own fault." Footsteps approached, and Eleanor's hand went to the rifle she'd dropped. But it was Goyatli, appearing out of the darkness with two other warriors. They took in the situation at a glance. Goyatli spoke in Apache, gesturing. One of the warriors bent down and simply picked Talon up, slinging him over his shoulder like he weighed nothing. Talon started to protest, but Goyatli cut him off with a sharp word. Cochise appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "The fight is over. 4 outlaws dead, 3 escaped into the desert. We will hunt them tomorrow. Now we must go. More white men may come." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to do more than follow as they moved through the darkness. They'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd actually done it. Talon was alive. They were alive. The reality of it hit her all at once, and her legs went weak. Cochise caught her arm, steadying her. "You did well," he said quietly, "for a white woman who cannot shoot." Eleanor almost laughed, almost cried, did both a little bit. They reached where the horses waited. Sky was there, along with the Apache warriors' mounts and several horses the outlaws would no longer need. Goyatli helped load Talon onto Sky, then gestured for Eleanor to mount behind him. She did, wrapping her arms around Talon's waist, feeling him sag back against her. He was warm and solid and alive, and that was all that mattered. They rode through the night, a strange procession of Apache warriors and one battered translator and one white woman who'd crossed every line she'd been raised to respect. Eleanor held tight to Talon and watched the stars wheel overhead and tried to process everything that had happened. She'd killed no one, had barely even raised her rifle. But she'd been part of a raid, had helped free a prisoner, had worked with Apache warriors against white men. There would be consequences for that, she knew. Legal consequences, social consequences. She'd crossed from curious oddity to actual traitor in the eyes of the territorial government. But she couldn't bring herself to care, not with Talon's heart beating steady against her chest, his breathing evening out as the adrenaline faded and exhaustion took over. They rode for hours, until the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Finally, they came over a rise and Eleanor saw it. Nalin's camp, spread out in the valley below, cook fires already burning, people beginning to stir with the new day. Goyatli called out as they approached, and people emerged from the wickiups to see what the commotion was. Nalin appeared, took one look at her son slumped on the horse, and her face went hard with fury and fear in equal measure. She barked orders, and suddenly everyone was moving. Warriors helped Talon down from Sky, half-carried him toward Nalin's wickiup. Women appeared with water and bandages and herbs. Children were shooed away, told to give space. Eleanor dismounted on shaking legs and would have fallen if Kaya hadn't appeared at her side, catching her arm. "What happened?" Kaya asked, her eyes wide. "Later," Eleanor managed. "Is he going to be all right?" "My aunt is the best healer in the tribe. If anyone can help him, she can. Come, you need to sit down before you collapse." But Eleanor shook her head. "I need to be with him." Kaya looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Eleanor's face stopped her. Instead, she just nodded and led Eleanor toward the wickiup where they'd taken Talon. Inside, it was dim and crowded. Nalin knelt beside her son, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over his injuries. An older woman Eleanor didn't recognize was grinding something in a bowl. Herbs or medicine, Eleanor guessed. Other women hovered nearby with supplies. Nalin looked up when Eleanor entered. Their eyes met, and for a moment Eleanor expected to be thrown out, told she wasn't wanted, wasn't family enough to be here. Instead, Nalin gestured to the space beside her. "Sit," she said in heavily accented English. "Hold his hand. He will want to know you are here." Eleanor sank down beside Talon, taking his hand in both of hers. His eyes were closed, his face pale beneath the bruises, but his fingers tightened around hers when she touched him. Nalin worked in silence, cleaning wounds, applying poultices, binding ribs with practiced movements. The older woman brought her the bowl of ground herbs mixed with something that smelled sharp and medicinal, and Nalin spread it carefully over the worst of the cuts and bruises. Finally, she sat back, wiping her hands on a cloth. She spoke to Eleanor in Apache, her voice weary. Kaya, who'd slipped in to watch, translated quietly. She says he will live. Broken ribs, many bruises, a concussion perhaps, but nothing that will not heal with time and rest. Kaya paused. She says you brought him back. She asks how. Eleanor looked at Nalin, at this strong woman who'd survived so much, who'd raised a son caught between two worlds and loved him anyway. Goyathle and his warriors did the fighting. I just refused to let him go. When Kaya translated, Nalin's expression softened. She reached out and touched Eleanor's face, a gentle touch, almost tender. She spoke again, longer this time. She says you are braver than you look, Kaya translated, and there was wonder in her voice. She says you rode into danger for her son when you could have run to safety. She says you worked with Apache warriors against white men, even knowing what that will cost you. She says, Kaya's voice caught. She says you are truly Apache now, in the ways that matter. She says you are her daughter, if you wish to be. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Nalin, at the acceptance in her weathered face, and felt something break open in her chest, all the fear and loneliness and desperation of the past months pouring out at once. Tell her yes, Eleanor whispered. Tell her I would be honored. Nalin pulled Eleanor into her arms, holding her like she was precious, like she was family. And Eleanor, who'd lost her own parents, who'd been alone and scared for so long, finally let herself break down and cry against this stranger's shoulder who wasn't a stranger anymore. Behind them, Talon's eyes flickered open. Through the haze of pain and medicine, he saw Eleanor in his mother's arms, saw the way Nalin was holding her with fierce protective love. Saw Goyathle standing in the doorway with respect in his eyes instead of suspicion. Something had changed, something fundamental and important. And as consciousness slipped away again, Talon's last thought was that maybe, just maybe, the impossible was becoming possible after all. Outside the wickiup, the sun rose over the Apache camp, painting the world in shades of gold and copper. The night's violence was over. The immediate danger had passed, but Eleanor knew, even as she let Nalin comfort her, even as she felt the acceptance of the Apache women gathering around them, that this was far from finished. The outlaws who'd escaped would report back to whoever ran their operation. The territorial authorities would hear about an Apache raid, about a white woman fighting alongside warriors against white men. Chet and his ranchers would use it as evidence that the Apache couldn't be trusted, that stronger measures were needed. War was coming. Eleanor could feel it in the air, could see it in the grim faces of the warriors, could hear it in the worried whispers of the women. But for now, in this moment, Talon was alive. Eleanor was accepted, and they had each other and the support of people who'd chosen to stand with them. It would have to be enough. Later, when Talon woke properly, Eleanor was still there beside him. Her head had dropped onto her folded arms beside his pallet, exhaustion finally claiming her. Talon looked at her. At the dirt on her face, the tears dried on her cheeks, the raw determination even in sleep. She'd come for him. This woman who'd had every reason to use the key he'd given her, to take the money and disappear into a new life far from all this chaos. She'd ridden into the desert alone, faced armed killers, worked with Apache warriors she barely knew, all to save him. And in doing so, she'd answered the question he'd been too afraid to ask. This marriage wasn't just politics anymore. It wasn't just survival. It was real. Talon reached out with his good hand and gently touched Eleanor's hair. She stirred, lifting her head, her eyes meeting his. "You're awake," she said, relief flooding her voice. "Thanks to you," Talon said. His voice was rough, painful. "Eleanor, what you did was what any wife would do," she interrupted. "No," Talon said firmly. "It was what someone extraordinary would do, what someone brave and loyal and far better than I deserve would do." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears again. Don't say that. You gave me a choice, Talon, a real choice, when no one else ever had. You gave me freedom and respect and a place in a world I didn't understand. You made me part of something bigger than myself. I didn't save you out of obligation. I saved you because I—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "Because you what?" Talon asked gently. Eleanor took a shaking breath. Because I love you. I don't know when it happened. Maybe somewhere between the Apache camp and learning your language and watching you try so hard to protect everyone. But it's true. I love you, and I wasn't going to let you die without knowing it. Talon's eyes shone with emotion. He pulled her down carefully, mindful of his injuries, until her forehead rested against his. Eleanor Price Greyhawk, he said softly, you are the most terrifying, wonderful woman I've ever known. Is that a yes? Eleanor asked, a smile breaking through the tears. That's a yes, Talon confirmed. I love you too, have for a while now, though I tried not to because it seemed impossibly complicated. Everything about us is impossibly complicated, Eleanor pointed out. True, Talon agreed, but somehow that makes it perfect. They stayed like that, forehead to forehead, breathing together, while around them the Apache camp came fully awake and the new day began. Whatever came next, war or peace, acceptance or rejection, life or death, they'd face it together. And that, Eleanor thought, was worth every risk she'd taken to get here. The peace that followed the rescue lasted exactly 3 days. Talon spent those days healing in his mother's camp, his ribs slowly knitting back together, the swelling in his face gradually receding. Eleanor stayed by his side, learning more about Apache medicine from Nalin and the other healers, her hands finally becoming useful instead of just willing. She ground herbs, prepared poultices, fetched water, and somewhere in those quiet tasks found a rhythm that felt like belonging. But on the morning of the 4th day, riders appeared on the eastern ridge. Soldiers, a full company of them, led by a territorial marshal Eleanor recognized from Tucson. They came armed and ready, their intentions clear before they'd spoken a single word. The Apache camp mobilized instantly. Warriors grabbed weapons, women hurried children into the wickiups, and Goyathle positioned his men in defensive formations that spoke of too much practice at this particular dance. Eleanor's stomach dropped. This was it. The consequence she'd known was coming. The territorial government had learned about the raid, about her involvement, and they'd come to extract their own brand of justice. Talon tried to stand, tried to position himself between his people and the approaching soldiers despite his injuries. Eleanor pushed him back down with gentle firmness. Stay, she said. Let me handle this. Eleanor, they'll arrest you. They might— I know what they might do, Eleanor interrupted, but I also know that if you go out there hurt and angry, someone will get shot. Let me try talking first. Talon looked like he wanted to argue, but Nalin placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking rapidly in Apache. Whatever she said made him relent, though his eyes were dark with worry. Eleanor walked out to meet the soldiers alone, her head high, her hands empty and visible. She was acutely aware of all the eyes watching her, Apache warriors ready to defend their camp, soldiers ready to enforce territorial law, and somewhere between them the life she and Talon had been trying to build. The marshal dismounted when he saw her approaching. His name was Coleman, and Eleanor remembered him as one of the more reasonable men in Tucson's territorial office. His face was grim but not hostile. Mrs. Greyhawk, he said, and there was something almost like regret in his voice. I'm afraid I need you to come with us. On what charges? Eleanor asked, keeping her voice steady. Aiding and abetting Apache raiders in an attack on white citizens. Conspiracy to commit murder. Theft of horses. Coleman's jaw tightened. The 3 outlaws who escaped the attack made it back to Tucson. They told quite a story about how you and your Apache friends murdered their companions in cold blood. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. Those men were gun runners, Marshal Coleman. They were using Apache territory to smuggle illegal weapons, stealing cattle, and blaming it on the Apache to cover their tracks. They kidnapped and intended to murder my husband. We were defending ourselves. That's not how they tell it, Coleman said. And right now their version is the one the territorial governor is hearing. The ranchers are demanding action. The townspeople are scared. There's talk of sending the army in to clear out the Apache camps by force. He paused. If you come peacefully, testify to what you know, maybe we can sort this out before it becomes a bloodbath. And if I don't come peacefully? Coleman's expression hardened. Then I have orders to take you by force and to arrest Talon Greyhawk as well on charges of inciting Apache violence against white settlers. The governor wants him out of the picture, Mrs. Greyhawk. He thinks your husband has become too sympathetic to the Apache cause, that he's lost his objectivity. Eleanor felt cold fury wash through her. They were going to use her as leverage against Talon, use him as a scapegoat for tensions that had been building long before either of them arrived on the scene. It was politics and prejudice wrapped in the language of law, and it would end with good people dead or imprisoned for crimes they hadn't committed. Unless she could find a way to change the narrative. "I'll come with you," Eleanor said quietly, "but on one condition." Coleman's eyebrows rose. "You're not really in a position to make conditions." "Maybe not, but hear me out anyway." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I'll testify. I'll tell everything I know about the gun runners, about the raid, about everything that's happened, but I want to do it publicly. In front of the Territorial Council, the ranchers, the Apache leaders, everyone who has a stake in what happens next. No closed-door hearings, no quiet deals, everything out in the open."
"Why would I agree to that?" "Because you know something's wrong here, Marshall. I can see it in your face. You know the outlaw's story doesn't add up. You know Talon has been trying to prevent violence, not cause it. And you know that if this escalates into open war between the settlers and the Apache, a lot of innocent people on both sides will die." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "Give me a chance to tell the truth. Publicly. With witnesses. If I'm lying, if the evidence doesn't support what I say, then arrest me and throw me in jail. But if I'm telling the truth, don't you think people deserve to hear it before they start a war?" Coleman was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Behind him, his soldiers shifted restlessly, hands near their weapons. Behind Eleanor, she could feel the Apache warriors watching, waiting to see if they'd need to fight. Finally, Coleman nodded slowly. "All right, you get your public hearing, but it happens in 3 days and you're in custody until then. Those are my terms." "Agreed," Eleanor said, but I want your word that the Apache camp won't be touched while I'm gone. No raids, no arrests, no provocations. You're asking a lot." "I'm giving you a chance to avoid a war," Eleanor countered. "That seems worth a lot." Coleman sighed, then extended his hand. "You have my word. The camp is left alone until after the hearing." Eleanor shook his hand, sealing the agreement. Then she turned back toward the Wickiups, toward where Talon had emerged despite his injuries, leaning heavily on Goyatle's arm. "Eleanor, no!" Talon called out, his voice rough with panic and pain. "Don't do this. They'll twist your words. They'll hear the truth," Eleanor said firmly. She walked to him, took his face in her hands, looked into his eyes. "Trust me. I know what I'm doing." "I can't lose you," Talon said, and there was raw fear in his voice. "Not now, not after everything." "You won't," Eleanor promised. "But I need to do this. For us, for your people, for any chance at a real future." She kissed him gently, carefully, mindful of his split lip. "I love you. Remember that, no matter what happens." Before Talon could respond, before she could lose her nerve, Eleanor turned and walked back to where Coleman waited. The marshal helped her onto a spare horse, and within minutes they were riding away from the Apache camp, back toward Tucson and whatever waited there. Eleanor didn't look back. If she looked back, she'd see Talon's face, and she'd lose her courage. So she kept her eyes forward and her spine straight and tried to believe that what she was doing would actually make a difference. The 3 days Eleanor spent in custody were the longest of her life. They kept her in a small room above the marshal's office. Not quite a cell, but locked from the outside. She had a bed, a window, basic necessities. Coleman even sent up decent food. But she was a prisoner nonetheless, cut off from Talon and the Apache camp, alone with her thoughts and her fears. On the second day, she had a visitor. The land office clerk who'd been present at her wedding appeared with the carved wooden box Eleanor had left in her canvas bag when she was arrested. "Thought you might want this," he said awkwardly, setting it on the small table. "Personal effects and all." Eleanor looked at the box, at the intricate carvings that had once been mysterious but now felt familiar. Inside was the key, the letter, the promise of freedom Talon had given her, the escape route she'd chosen not to take. "Thank you," she said quietly. The clerk hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I think you got a raw deal. Your husband's a good man, better than most white men I know, if I'm being honest. I hope the hearing goes your way."
It was a small kindness, but it warmed Eleanor's heart more than the man could know. On the third day, they came for her early. Coleman himself, along with 2 deputies, escorted her to the territorial building where the hearing would be held. The main hall had been set up with chairs and benches, and it was already packed with people. Eleanor recognized faces from town, shopkeepers, ranchers, the judge who'd officiated her wedding. She saw territorial officials in their formal suits, military officers in uniform. And in the back, she saw Apache leaders including Nalin, Goyatle, and Cochise, their presence a testament to how seriously they took this proceeding. But she didn't see Talon. Her heart sank. Had something happened? Was he too injured to travel? Or had the territorial government decided to arrest him anyway, breaking their agreement? Coleman must have seen her looking. "He's here," he said quietly. "Waiting outside. The governor didn't want him in the room during your testimony. Thought it might be seen as intimidation." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she understood the politics of it. This hearing was theater as much as justice. Everyone needed to feel like they were getting a fair shake, even if the whole thing was rigged from the start. The territorial governor, a portly man named Harrison with shrewd eyes and political ambitions, called the hearing to order. He explained the charges against Eleanor, outlined the testimony from the outlaws who'd survived, and made it clear that this was a very serious matter that threatened the peace of the entire territory. Then he called Eleanor to testify. She walked to the front of the room, feeling every eye on her. Some looks were curious, some hostile, some sympathetic. She tried to ignore all of them and focus on what she needed to say. Governor Harrison started with basic questions. Her name, where she was from, how she'd come to be in Arizona. Eleanor answered clearly and honestly, establishing her credibility. Then he moved to the harder questions. "Mrs. Greyhawk, you're accused of participating in an Apache raid that resulted in the deaths of 4 white men. How do you respond to these charges?" Eleanor took a breath. "I was present when Apache warriors attacked a group of outlaws in the desert, but it wasn't a raid. It was a rescue mission. Those men had kidnapped my husband, burned our home, and were planning to torture and kill him to prevent him from exposing their criminal activities." A murmur ran through the crowd. Governor Harrison raised a hand for silence. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof?" "I have my testimony. I have the testimony of the Apache warriors who were there. And I have the fact that the 3 men who survived and made these accusations against me are the same men who were running guns through Apache territory, stealing cattle, and blaming it on the Apache to cover their illegal activities. One of the outlaws, a thin man with a cruel mouth who Eleanor recognized from the camp, jumped to his feet. "That's a lie. We never ran no guns. We're honest ranchers, and that Apache-loving whore is trying to—" "Sit down," Governor Harrison said sharply. "You'll have your chance to speak." But the damage was done. The word whore hung in the air, and Eleanor saw the way some of the faces in the crowd hardened with disgust. A white woman married to an Apache. A white woman who fought alongside warriors against her own people. In their eyes, she'd already condemned herself. Eleanor forced herself to continue. For months, someone has been using Apache territory to smuggle illegal weapons. They've been stealing cattle and leaving Apache signs at the crime scenes to blame the raids on Talon's people. This has stirred up hatred between the ranchers and the Apache, made it impossible to negotiate peace. My husband discovered evidence of this operation and was trying to bring it to the territorial authorities when he was attacked. "Evidence," Harrison said. "What evidence?" Eleanor hesitated. This was the weak point in her story. Talon had been gathering proof, but it had all been in their house when the outlaws burned it. Everything was gone. Documents, testimony, physical evidence. All they had left was their word, and the word of a white woman who'd married an Apache wasn't worth much in this room. Before she could answer, the door at the back of the hall opened. Talon walked in, moving stiffly but under his own power. Beside him was someone Eleanor hadn't expected to see. Kaya, the young Apache woman from the mission school. Governor Harrison frowned. "Mr. Greyhawk, I specifically asked you to wait outside." "I know," Talon said. His voice was still rough, but it carried authority. "But I have evidence that's relevant to this hearing, evidence that supports everything my wife has testified." He nodded to Kaya, who stepped forward carrying a leather satchel. She opened it and pulled out a bundle of papers, setting them on the table in front of the governor. Before the outlaws burned our house, Talon explained, I had hidden copies of my investigation in my mother's camp, shipping manifests showing illegal weapon sales, testimony from Apache scouts who witnessed the gun running, even a letter from one of the outlaws to their supplier detailing their operations. Eleanor's heart leaped. He'd had backup copies. Of course he had. Talon was too careful, too thorough to rely on a single set of documents. Governor Harrison picked up the papers, examining them with growing interest. His expression shifted from skeptical to thoughtful to deeply troubled. These are quite detailed, he said slowly. If authentic, they paint a very different picture than what we've been led to believe. They're authentic, Talon said, and I can provide witnesses who will corroborate everything in those documents. Apache witnesses, yes, but also Mexican traders who've seen the gun shipments, and even a few white ranchers who've had their doubts about the story being told. The thin outlaw jumped up again. He's lying. Those papers are forgeries. You can't trust anything an Indian says. But Governor Harrison was still reading, his frown deepening. Finally, he looked up at the outlaws. These documents include details about your operations that couldn't possibly have been forged. Shipment routes, contact names, even the serial numbers of specific weapons. His eyes went cold. I think we need to have a much longer conversation, gentlemen. Marshal Coleman, please place these 3 men under arrest pending a full investigation. The room erupted. The outlaws tried to run but were quickly subdued by Coleman's deputies. The ranchers were shouting questions, demanding explanations. The Apache leaders watched with satisfaction, vindication written on their faces. Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. Talon had done it. He'd proven the truth, exposed the real criminals, given them all a chance at actual justice. Harrison banged his gavel, calling for order. When the room finally quieted, he turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Greyhawk, in light of this new evidence, I'm dismissing all charges against you. It's clear you were acting in defense of your husband against criminals, not participating in an unprovoked attack. He paused. I apologize for the territory's treatment of you. You've been poorly served by our justice system. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The relief was too overwhelming, the fear she'd been carrying for days finally releasing its grip on her chest. But Harrison wasn't finished. He turned to address the room at large. It's also clear that we've been operating on false information regarding the Apache people. We've allowed criminals to manipulate our fear and prejudice, to turn neighbor against neighbor for their own profit. That ends today. He looked at the Apache leaders. I propose a formal peace negotiation. Real talks, in good faith, with the goal of establishing fair boundaries and mutual respect. The Apache will be guaranteed their traditional lands in the mountains. The settlers will have protected territory for ranching and farming, and will work together to root out the criminals who've been exploiting both our peoples. Nalin stood, speaking in Apache. Talon translated for the room. My mother says the Apache people have heard promises before. Many promises, most of them broken. She asks why this time should be different. Harrison met Nalin's eyes directly. Because this time, we have someone who can bridge both worlds. Someone both sides can trust. He looked at Talon. Mr. Greyhawk, I'm offering you an official position as territorial liaison to the Apache nations. You'll have authority to negotiate on behalf of the territory with the full backing of my office. And you'll have the freedom to advocate for your people's interests without fear of reprisal. The room went silent. This was unprecedented, giving an Apache man real political power, real authority in territorial affairs. Eleanor could see the shock on faces throughout the hall. Talon looked at his mother. They had a silent conversation, the kind only family can have with just a glance. Finally, Nalin nodded. I accept, Talon said, on the condition that my wife works alongside me. She's proven she can stand between two worlds, can speak hard truths to both sides. The Apache trust her now. If we're really going to build lasting peace, it needs voices like hers. Eleanor's eyes widened. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for it. But looking at the faces in the room, Apache and white, rancher and warrior, all watching to see what would happen next, she realized this was exactly what was needed. Someone who belonged to neither side completely, which meant she could belong to both. I accept as well, she said, her voice steady and clear. Harrison smiled. Then we have an agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've just witnessed the beginning of something new for this territory. Something better than what we've had. The room erupted again, but this time with conversation instead of chaos. People were arguing, debating, already starting to work through what this new arrangement might look like. It wasn't universal approval. Eleanor could see plenty of skeptical and hostile faces. But it was a start. Talon made his way through the crowd to Eleanor's side. Despite his injuries, despite the formal setting, he pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "You did it," he said into her hair. "You crazy, brave, impossible woman. You actually did it." "We did it," Eleanor corrected. "Together." Around them, the formal hearing was dissolving into smaller conversations. Ranchers were cautiously approaching Apache leaders with Cochise translating. Territorial officials were examining Talon's evidence with new eyes. And Governor Harrison was already organizing the first official peace negotiation, to be held in 1 week's time. Eleanor felt Nalin's hand on her shoulder. Talon's mother spoke in Apache, her voice warm with pride. "She says you have honored her son and her people," Kaya translated, appearing at Eleanor's elbow with a smile. "She says you are truly her daughter now, and the Apache will remember what you did here today." Eleanor turned and embraced Nalin, feeling the older woman's strength and acceptance wrap around her like a blessing. When they separated, Eleanor saw tears in Nalin's eyes, tears of relief and hope and the beginning of healing. Goyathle approached next, the young warrior who'd questioned her so fiercely at their first meeting. He spoke in Apache, then switched to his halting English. "You have warrior heart," he said simply. "Apache honor warrior heart, no matter what skin it wears." He extended his hand in the white custom, and Eleanor shook it, feeling the significance of the gesture. The crowd was beginning to disperse, people heading back to their homes and camps with much to think about. Coleman appeared at Eleanor's side with the carved wooden box. "Thought you'd want this back," he said. "Sorry for the accommodations these past few days." "You were doing your job," Eleanor said, taking the box. "And you kept your word about protecting the Apache camp. That meant more than you know." Coleman nodded and moved off. Eleanor looked down at the box, at the symbol of freedom it represented. She'd been carrying it as insurance, as a reminder that she always had a choice, but she didn't need it anymore. "Come with me," she said to Talon, taking his hand. They walked together through the thinning crowd, out of the territorial building, into the bright Arizona sunshine. Eleanor led Talon to a quiet spot behind the building, away from curious eyes. Then she opened the carved box and took out the key and the letter. She held them for a moment, remembering the day Talon had given them to her, remembering what they'd meant then and what they meant now. "Do you remember what you wrote?" Eleanor asked. "About marriage not being a prison?" "Every word," Talon said softly. "You gave me freedom when I had none. You gave me choice when I had no power. You gave me respect when everyone else saw me as just a problem to be solved." Eleanor smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "And now I'm giving these back to you, not because I don't want them, but because I don't need them anymore." She held out the key and the letter to Talon. He stared at them, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Eleanor, I can't. You should keep them. Just in case things get difficult again. Just in case." "Just in case what?" Eleanor interrupted gently. "Just in case I change my mind about loving you? Just in case I decide that being your partner in building peace between our peoples isn't what I want? Those things aren't going to happen, Talon. I'm here, I'm staying, and I don't need an escape route because I'm not looking for an escape." Talon took the key and letter with shaking hands. He looked at them, at the symbol of trust he'd given her, now being returned with even deeper meaning. Then he did something Eleanor didn't expect. He walked to the small forge behind the blacksmith shop next door, asked the smith for a moment with the tools, and began to work the silver key with practiced hands. Eleanor watched as he heated and shaped the metal, as the key slowly transformed under his skilled manipulation. The blacksmith watched too, curious, and offered advice and better tools. Within an hour, Talon had reshaped the key into something new. A pendant. Simple and beautiful, the silver wrought into a design that combined Apache symbols with something more universal, 2 circles interlinked, separate but joined, neither dominating the other. Talon threaded it onto a leather cord and held it out to Eleanor. "This was supposed to represent your freedom to leave," he said. "Now it represents something else. Two people choosing to be together. Two peoples choosing to coexist. Two worlds joining without either losing what makes them unique." He fastened it around Eleanor's neck. "Will you wear it? Not as a symbol of escape, but as a symbol of choice freely made." Eleanor touched the pendant, feeling the warmth of the metal against her skin. "Always," she whispered. They stood together in the shadow of the territorial building, two people who'd started as strangers bound by desperation and had become partners bound by love. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Eleanor knew that. There would be setbacks and challenges, people who refused to accept the new peace, old hatreds that died hard. But they'd face it together. A week later, the formal peace negotiations began. They were held in neutral territory, in a valley between the Apache Mountains and the settled ranch lands. Representatives from both sides gathered under a canvas pavilion, with Talon and Eleanor serving as mediators. The first day was tense, full of old grievances and mutual suspicion. But slowly, carefully, with patience and persistence, they began to make progress. Land boundaries were drawn and agreed upon. Trade agreements were established. Procedures for handling disputes were created. And most importantly, both sides began to see each other as people rather than enemies. It took 3 weeks of negotiations, 3 weeks of late nights and careful compromises, and moments when everything seemed ready to fall apart. But in the end, they had something unprecedented, a formal treaty that both sides actually believed in. The signing ceremony was held on a bright morning in early autumn. Apache elders and territorial officials gathered together, their signatures marking a new chapter in the region's history. Nalin signed for her band, her hand steady, her eyes fierce with hope. Governor Harrison signed for the territory, and for once his political calculation aligned with doing what was right. And at the bottom of the treaty, in a section acknowledging the mediators who'd made it possible, 2 signatures appeared side by side. Talon Greyhawk and Eleanor Greyhawk. Equal partners, equal voices. 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had used that connection to build something bigger than themselves. After the ceremony, there was a celebration, a strange mixing of Apache and white traditions, with food and music and speeches from both sides. Eleanor stood with Talon, watching people mingle who'd been enemies just months before, and felt something like wonder at what they'd accomplished. "It won't last forever," Talon said quietly, reading her thoughts. "Treaties can be broken. People can forget their promises." "I know," Eleanor said, "but for today, for right now, we have peace. That's worth celebrating." "We have more than peace," Talon corrected, turning to face her fully. "We have each other. We have family. We have purpose and hope, and a future we're building together." He took her hands. "Eleanor, when I married you, I thought I was making a political gesture. I thought I was doing my duty to help my people." "And now?" Eleanor asked, even though she knew the answer. "Now I know I was being given the greatest gift of my life. I just wasn't smart enough to recognize it at first." Talon smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his whole face. "Marry me again. Not as a political arrangement, not as a treaty between peoples, just as 2 people who love each other and want to build a life together. Marry me because we choose each other, freely and completely." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "We're already married." "I know, but I want to do it right this time. I want to stand before both our peoples, Apache and white, my family and yours, and tell them all that you're my partner, my love, my choice. I want to erase any question about what we are to each other." Eleanor looked at this man who'd given her freedom and respect and a place to belong. This man who'd stood with her through violence and fear and political machinations. This man who'd shaped a key into a pendant to symbolize chosen love rather than forced obligation. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you again. As many times as you want, in as many ceremonies as you need. Because you're my choice too, Talon, today and always." They kissed there in the midst of the celebration, and around them people cheered, Apache and white together, celebrating not just a treaty, but a union that symbolized everything that treaty represented. The ceremony happened a month later, a blending of traditions that honored both their worlds. Nalin presided over the Apache portion, speaking blessings in her native language. The territorial judge who'd officiated their first wedding returned to handle the legal formalities, this time with warmth instead of irritation. And people from both communities gathered to witness and celebrate. Eleanor wore traditional Apache dress that Nalin and the other women had made for her, intricate beadwork telling the story of a woman who'd crossed between worlds. Talon wore a mixture of both cultures, Apache leggings and moccasins, but also a white man's shirt, symbolizing the bridge he'd always been. When they spoke their vows this time, they weren't reading from a script or going through mechanical motions. They looked at each other and spoke from their hearts. "I choose you," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "Not because I have to, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because you're the person I want to build a life with. You've shown me what true respect means, what partnership can be. You've given me a place in a world I never knew existed. I love you, Talon Greyhawk, and I'm honored to be your wife." Talon's eyes shone with emotion as he responded. "I choose you, Eleanor. You came into my life as a stranger and became my anchor. You've shown courage that puts warriors to shame. You've built bridges I thought impossible. You've loved me when you had every reason to run. I'm a better man because of you, and I'll spend my life trying to deserve the gift of your love." When they sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd erupted in celebration. Apache war cries mixed with white cheers, drums began to beat, and someone produced a fiddle. And soon people were dancing together, the barriers between cultures dissolving in the joy of the moment. Eleanor danced with Talon, then with Goyathle, who'd become a friend despite their rocky beginning. She danced with Marshal Coleman, and with Apache warriors, and with white ranchers who'd slowly begun to see past their prejudices. She danced with Kaya and with Nalin, with the women who'd taught her to scrape hides and gather herbs and survive in a harsh land. And through it all, she wore the silver pendant Talon had made for her, the symbol of choice, of love freely given, of two people deciding to face whatever came together. The celebration lasted until late into the night, and when Eleanor and Talon finally slipped away to the small house they'd rebuilt on the site of the old one, they did so as partners in every sense of the word. Not a white woman and an Apache man forced together by circumstance, but two people who'd chosen each other despite every obstacle, every prejudice, every reason to walk away. That night, lying in Talon's arms in their rebuilt home, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the scared 19-year-old who'd gotten on a train heading west with nothing but desperation driving her, about the woman who'd stood between armed men to protect people she barely knew, about the mediator who'd helped forge peace between warring peoples. She'd become someone she never could have imagined back in Kansas. Someone braver, stronger, more complete. "What are you thinking?" Talon asked softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "I'm thinking about gifts," Eleanor said, "about the gift you gave me when you offered me freedom, about how that gift led to all of this." "The silent gift," Talon murmured, "the one that said love must never be a cage." "The one that gave me room to choose you," Eleanor agreed, "and in choosing you, I found myself." They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Tomorrow they'd return to their work as territorial liaisons, to the ongoing negotiations and challenges of maintaining peace. Tomorrow they'd face the people who still opposed the treaty, who still saw them as traitors or oddities or threats. But tonight they were just two people who loved each other, who'd built something beautiful out of desperation and fear and impossible circumstances. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched Eleanor arrive in Arizona all those months ago. The same desert that had seemed so foreign and frightening now felt like home. And the man beside her, who'd started as a stranger with a desperate plan, was now the person who knew her better than anyone ever had. They'd silenced the doubters not with words, but with actions. They'd proven that love could cross any divide if both people were brave enough to choose it. They'd shown that marriage could be a partnership of equals, that respect and freedom were foundations for lasting love. And they'd done it all while helping to build peace between peoples who'd been enemies for generations. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Eleanor knew there would be hard times ahead, knew that prejudice and hatred didn't disappear overnight, knew that maintaining peace would be constant work, but it was a real ending, an honest one, built on choice and courage and the determination to see each other as fully human. Years later, when people would ask Eleanor about her marriage, about how a white woman from Kansas had ended up as the wife of an Apache translator and a key figure in territorial peace negotiations, she would always tell them about the gift, about the carved wooden box and the silver key inside it, about the letter that had promised her freedom when she had none, about the man who'd valued her choice more than his own convenience, and about how that gift, that silent, powerful gift of respected freedom, had given her the space to discover what she really wanted, which turned out to be the man who'd offered her an escape route, the people who'd taught her strength and a life bigger and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined. She would tell them how the key had been transformed into a pendant, how the symbol of escape had become a symbol of chosen commitment. And she would touch that pendant, still worn around her neck decades later, and smile with the knowledge that the best gifts are the ones that set you free to choose love. Talon and Eleanor Greyhawk lived long lives together, their partnership becoming legendary in territorial history. They raised children who belonged to both worlds, who spoke both languages, who carried forward the work of building bridges between cultures. They saw peace hold and occasionally falter, and they were always there to help repair it when it frayed. And when they were old and gray, sitting on the porch of their house watching the sun set over the mountains, they would sometimes talk about that first desperate marriage ceremony, about how neither of them could have known what they were beginning, about how the scared girl and the lonely translator had become partners who changed history.
"Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor would ask, though she knew the answer. "Never," Talon would reply, taking her weathered hand in his. "You were the best choice I never knew I was making." "We were lucky," Eleanor would say. "We were brave," Talon would correct. "Luck is what happens when bravery meets opportunity. We made our own fortune." And Eleanor would nod, touching the silver pendant she still wore, and agree. They'd been brave enough to choose each other, brave enough to fight for that choice, brave enough to build something lasting from the most unlikely of beginnings. The wedding gift that had silenced the whole town wasn't gold or jewels or property. It was respect. It was freedom. It was the acknowledgement that love without choice was prison, and prison could never be the foundation for anything good. Talon had given Eleanor the power to leave, and in doing so, he'd given her the power to truly stay, to choose him not from desperation, but from love. To build a life together, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That was the gift that had changed everything. The silent gift that spoke louder than any words could. The gift that said, "I see you. I respect you. I trust you to know your own heart." And Eleanor's gift in return was equally simple and equally profound. "I choose you. Not because I must, not because I have no other options, but because you're worth choosing." Together, they'd proven that the most powerful unions are built not on obligation or convenience, but on mutual respect and freely given love. They'd shown that marriage could be a partnership of equals, that different worlds could coexist, that courage and compassion could overcome prejudice and fear. And it had all started with a box, a key, and a letter that offered freedom. The wedding gift that silenced a town not through its material value, but through the revolutionary idea it represented, that love must always be a choice, never a cage. That was their story. That was their truth. And it echoed through generations, a testament to the power of respect, the importance of choice, and the enduring strength of love freely given and freely received.